What's up, guys? It's D22 Soso, Wayne Chung of the Professional Gamer Podcast is my VIP guest. Brian Weisman,
Hi, guys.
I've mentioned in previous podcasts and in Live with Mike Poker commentary I do that he is one of my Magic the Gathering mentors. Um, you have so many accolades, I don't even know. So in the beginning, we were in Palo Alto and around 1996, 95, 96, like I met you. You were already like, kind of the alpha guy in Magic. You were the creator of the deck, Blue White Control, and then you did well in the Pro Tours. You were one of the early pioneers of professional gaming in that era, and then you moved on to I think Diablo 2. Was
Yeah,
that right?
not as a professional thing. Diablo, I mean, it wasn't initially a professional thing. It began obviously as just a gaming endeavor. I played Diablo 1 ton, as did pretty much every person, every male of my generation. But when Diablo 2 came out, I think it came out in 1999. I was just immediately sucked into that game. But I only played it as just as a gaming endeavor for a while. And in fact, it wasn't until I want to say like late 1999, early 2000 when I got a frantic phone call from a very good friend of mine, someone you know personally, Matt Place, who was
Yes.
another pro gamer of my era. Phenomenal guy, amazing game designer, and one of my best friends. And he called me up and he said, Brian, you're not going to believe this. Go on eBay. People are selling items for Diablo 2 on eBay, which was the first thing I'd ever heard. And I guess there had been a few bits of precedent established prior to the Diablo secondary market for items, digital items in online games. I think maybe EverQuest was the first. I think Ultima Online as well maybe had itemization and a secondary market too. But Diablo 2 was my first awareness that that was actually a thing. And it's funny, I've told this story so many times over the years, but to people of modern sensibilities, if you're born in the last 20, 25 years, you've grown up with mobile gaming as a thing, probably. And certainly you've grown up with the free to play freemium model for games, where all games are essentially monetized through things that are bought and sold inside the context of the game. But in 1999 and 2000, that was totally unheard of. I mean, the internet as we know it was still really, really pretty nascent. It was only about 3 or 4 years old at that point. In terms of
The
broadly
commercialization, yeah.
commercialization and a broadly distributed web browser, which is kind of what really brought the internet out of the sort of out of the niche of just being kind of a thing that only geeks and nerds and people directly connected to tech knew about, and into the mainstream. It was really the internet went through its giant renaissance in like 1997, 1998, and so on. So it took a little while for secondary markets to develop around games, but Diablo 2's secondary market was sort of one of the first big, enormous secondary markets that attracted outside attention, specifically from me and from a number of other people that I knew. But I mean, I guess Magic Online came out right around that time, and I remember it was I think right around 2000, actually 1999, 2000. I mean, I could double check that, but it was really controversial at the time when their business model was selling digital cards. People freaked out about that and they said, "What the hell are you doing? That's so greedy. Like, why on earth would I pay $295 for a digital pack when that's the same price as a physical pack? And for you guys, that's obviously price gouging. It doesn't cost you anything to produce a digital pack. I can understand paying $295 because there's all these costs associated with creating a physical product. But people were really, really pissed off about the notion that Wizards of the Coast wanted to charge full retail price for digital packs. And so they had to create this bizarre redemption program. I'd be shocked if anybody ever actually used that. You remember that?
I remember that if you get a full set, you get to redeem it, right?
Right. You could turn in your full set of digital cards
For the
for
physical
for a
cards.
physical.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, it's totally useless, right? Because most of the cards in a set have no value, and to go through the trouble of accumulating an entire digital set of some random set, like whatever was available at the time, Scourge or Mercadian Masks or something. That was, one of the first sets. I think it might have been Invasion. Yeah, Invasion, Planeshift Apocalypse, I think were the sets that were online when it first came out.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, who knows how many people actually did that redemption? And I don't even know if they probably discontinued it
I
a long
do.
time.
We know one, Yubin Tao, but he would
Even
collect
actually
sets
did it?
because he collected sets because you could buy them for cheap on tickets, and then he would resell them
I
in
see.
physical form.
To get the that's so much work and grinding. Yeah, I mean, obviously we were all like desperate to figure out a way to actually monetize a Magic career back then, right? Because the Pro Tour, I mean, we'll probably talk about it a little bit later in terms of the pluses and minuses of the
Chronology.
Magic Pro Tour. But yeah, I mean, this speaks to what we were talking about before, that our sort of respective professional gaming careers were decades too early. Because
let's start from your Magic career, because let's do everything chronologically.
yeah,
So when did you get into Magic? Because I got in a little bit after you, and I was doing real-time real-time games are my forte, so to say, and it was kind of like when I took breaks in real-time games, that's when I would play Magic, and got introduced to you.
I see. For me, my big gaming endeavor was actually a real-time game before Magic came out. It was the game Street Fighter. Actually, I think I told you about it. I was a competitive Street Fighter player as much as you could be that in the early 1990s through the late part of my high school and then at the beginning of my college as well. This was like, if for people who are Street Fighter aficionados, and if there are gamers watching this, there are probably people that care about this, obviously, and have followed the chronology of those games. But in 1992, the version of Street Fighter that was out was actually my favorite version of the game. It was Super Street Fighter 2. It was just called Super Street Fighter 2. So the original game was, well, obviously there was original Street Fighter, which is just easy garbage. But Street Fighter 2 came out in, I think, around 1989 or 1990, and was followed subsequently by Champion Edition, then by Hyper Fighting. And then the version that came out after that, the first official version that came out, was called Super Street Fighter 2. And it was the one that introduced the 4 new characters beyond the original, I guess, 12. So I think Super Street Fighter 2 has 16 characters in it. It included DJ, Cammy, T-Hawk, and Fei Long. And the game has balance issues and it is very slow, which is something I liked about it. But it was an amazing game. And it was, for me, that was the first time to really devote a lot of my time, particularly because I was out of high school now and I actually could spend more time doing this. So I threw a lot of time at Super Street Fighter 2. And I happened to be playing and competing at what was actually, we didn't know this until people began to travel around and there was more internet communication a few years later. But there was one particular place in Golfland in Sunnyvale, the Sunnyvale Golfland, which was located in, well, people don't know where Sunnyvale is. It's near San Jose in California. And it just happened to be the nexus for Super Street Fighter 2 play in all of Northern California, which by extension made it the nexus of Street Fighter play pretty much for the entire United States. There was one pocket of really, really good players down in Southern California, where a couple of really legendary players also were competing. Those 2 locations really defined competitive Street Fighter play for a long period of time. And to this day, there are people who are still very prominent in that world, in that gaming world, who were competitors back in that era. So I was objectively not anywhere near one of the best players there. I would say I was probably top 12 maybe on a good day, because there were a lot of extremely good players. But because of who I competed against, I had prodigious skill relative to most other pockets of players, because just like in Magic and in many other games, you can only get a little bit better than the people you compete against. You can't really get a ton better unless you go up against more stalwart competition. It's just too hard. So I was a competitive Street Fighter player when I moved to Santa Cruz to go to school. I started there in 1992. Didn't hear about Magic all through 1993, although it came out in, I think it formally came out in August, although it had debuted at Gen Con in July of 1993. But as a consequence of the fact that the company that was producing it, Wizards of the Coast, which is actually, you can almost see it from my house out that way, in Renton, Wizards of the Coast was a tiny little company that was started by a guy named Peter Atkinson, who was a gamer himself, and he didn't have a lot of resources. So he was looking for products to go and promote to increase his business. And he happened to have struck up a friendship with Magic's creator, a guy named Richard Garfield. And Peter was basically pitched an idea to Richard and said, we really need a game that people can play for 15, 20 minutes at a time at a convention or something, at a gaming convention where they're going to play tabletop games like Dungeons and Dragons or whatever. And Richard had this game that he had been developing kind of off and on. And I know Richard really well, actually. He's quite a good friend of mine. And he lives in Bellevue, which is just on the other side of Lake Washington over here.
I met him in 1990, before I won anything in StarCraft, but I was already a top player. I met him at E3, and Scaphalias, I believe his name.
Yeah, Scaphalias. Yeah. Scaphalias is a very close friend of his. They're actually still business partners to this day. He has a company called 3 Donkeys, and Scaph and Richard are 2 of those 3 donkeys. And Scaff also still lives in Bellevue. I see him periodically as well. Scaff's role in his primary role as far as Magic is concerned, in addition to being one of the initial developers, one of the initial testers of the alpha set, helped with the development of early Magic sets. But Scaff's main contribution was that he was the guy who's credited with coming up with the Pro Tour, which in 1996 seemed like a really big, a tough sell, particularly because Magic the Gathering, anybody that's ever, I saw these actually a couple of days ago, unfortunately, but one of the biggest conundrums facing the company, Wizard of the Coast, was how do we promote this game to the masses? Because Magic pretty much propagated virally through the early internet. That's how most people found out about it. Of course, you didn't really have much of the internet until 1996, 1997. And the game came out in 1993.
Well, 95, at least in Palo Alto, and you went to Palo Alto High School, I went to Gunn High School. That's where it was already on the uptrend, and it just, the first 5 years skyrocketed. Yeah.
On what was called the Usenet at the time. And so for people who use the internet today generally have no inkling of the way that the internet looked before it was a website that you would log into, before there were browsers like Firefox, for example, or Chrome or Safari or whatever. When you logged into the internet before, you would log in with your modem and you'd have to type in this very intricate long address for a particular news group or discussion that you wanted to go and converse about. So in the case of Magic, you had to know that you would log into rec.games.tradingcards.deckmaster.magic.marketplace or .strategy or something. You had to type all that in just to get access to talk to people about the game. So it's really, really very, very hard for anybody who wasn't extremely internet savvy to even tap into that world at all to learn anything about it. So I didn't do anything related to the internet at all and Magic itself for quite a while, for a couple of years. And there were, people were playing Street Fighter competitively and people were talking about Street Fighter strategy on the Usenet as well, which I didn't know anything about. And obviously there was a big overlap between those demographics. But when I went to Santa Cruz, getting back to what I was saying about the game coming out in I think formally in July, and then it debuted at Gen Con with a set called Alpha, which they were barely able to print at all because Wizard of the Coast was a tiny little company. And a lot of people look back at the early Magic sets, Alpha, Beta, Unlimited, Arabian Nights, Legends, and so on, and they go, or Antiquities, and they go, why the hell did they make more of this stuff? Clearly they could sell every single pack that they produced times 10, and they didn't hardly make anything. And it was entirely just economics. It was basically the fact that they wanted to print more, but they literally spent every single dollar that they had. So when they printed Alpha, they took all the money they made from Alpha and they printed Beta with that. And they took all the money from Beta and they printed Unlimited and Arabians and so on. And in fact, I had lunch with Peter Atkinson, the former CEO and founder of Wizard of the Coast, about a year ago. And he relayed several really cool stories to me about the very early parts of the early days of the game. One of them was he asked me to guess how much they spent collectively on the entire print run of Arabian Nights, what the entire print run of Arabian Nights cost. If you had to hazard a guess, what would you guess? It cost them to make every single card that they printed for that set.
I couldn't even guess. $8,000.
It's a low ball. I would have guessed higher than that, substantially higher. I would have guessed probably $250,000. It turns out it was only $80,000 to print every single Arabian Nights card, which incidentally is the cost today of about 40 sealed packs of Arabian Nights on the secondary market. They're about $2,000 each if you get them out of a box.
I guess really low because you said they were like leveraging, so it was.
Oh yeah, they were everything was just rolled back in. So if you look at the sort of exponential growth of Magic availability, you can see that in action based on how much of each subsequent set gets printed. So for example, the print run of Alpha was so low that there was something around 1,000 of every Alpha rare were printed initially. So if you have an Alpha Black Lotus, you have one of 1,000. And those are obviously originally, of course, some large subset of those original Alpha Lotuses were lost or destroyed because people played without sleeves and there was no inkling that the cards would ever have value, long-term value. Certainly no one would ever envision that there could be Alpha Black Lotuses out there worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Individual single Alpha Black Lotus is worth that much. But Beta was printed roughly 3 times. There were roughly 3 times as many Beta cards printed as Alpha. And then by the time that Unlimited came along, they were able to increase the print run by, I think, 3 to 4 times that. So it's around 14 to 15,000 of every unlimited rare. But Arabian Nights had a tiny little print run compared to it. I remember when Legends came out, and I was going to UC Santa Cruz at the time. They were rationing Legends to 2 packs per person, and there was a line that went all the way through the Santa Cruz downtown for people to line up to buy 2 packs, and people were bribing people on the street to go in and buy them 2 packs and so on, because everyone was so starved for product.
So if we remember in Legends, Superstars, which is now Channel Fireball, owned by John Sasso, Mana Drain, one of the key cards in Legends, John Sasso sold it for 75 cents, and everyone was in uproar. How can an uncommon be 75 cents?
How outrageous that was. Insane.
Yeah.
Mana Drain, I mean, obviously it's one of those cards like Sarah Angel and Soul Ring that people were incredulous about the fact that because at the very beginning, no one even knew what rarities were. None of the rarities were published. Nowadays, obviously, spoilers come out weeks in advance of a set coming out. Everything has an expansion symbol and a color. So it's really clear. And they were very reluctant to actually even have, this is something that Richard Garfield cared about at some point, because I'm not really sure what was driving it really. I think that he really wanted for the game to have a sense of mystery to it. And he felt like disclosing spoilers and disclosing rarities removed that sense of mystery from it, from the whole process of opening up booster packs, which I'm sure you experienced. I remember this myself, opening up packs and seeing cards I'd never seen before, and really, it was palpably exciting. And you would play matches against people, and they would have cards you'd never seen before, and that was really exciting too. So that was sort of part of his vision. And I think that not having rarities that were clearly communicated to the player was part of that. So people would look at cards like Soul Ring and Sarah Angel, 2 of the best cards in Alpha, and Icy Manipulator and Demonic Tutor, and they would go, what? This is so good. This clearly has to be a rare card. And Mana Drain, obviously, Mana Drain is, I mean, I think unequivocally the best card in all of Legends. It's the strongest card in Legends, and it's an uncommon. And on top of that, Legends had this issue with A and B boxes, where half of the print run of Legends, the sheets that those boxes were that they cut up and then put into the packs that went into those boxes, half of the boxes did not have Mana Drain in them. You could not get a Mana Drain in half the boxes. The other half had double the number of Mana Drains that you normally would have expected. But yeah, because they just had this weird collation error to this day, all the Legends boxes still have it. And there's no way to tell. There's literally no way to tell, as far as I know, if you have an A or a B box. Maybe it's the serial number on the bottom, because it's probably correlated to that about when it was made. I don't know. The quality control in the early days of the game was just abysmal. I mean, utterly abysmal. The fact that Alpha was just missing 2 cards. It's missing Volcanic Island and Circle Protection Black. They're just not in the set. But anyway, so to get back to your initial question, 1994 rolls around, and I haven't heard of the game. I'm still competing in Street Fighter all the time. And because I was living in Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz is, it's 2 or 3 bus rides and a train ride away from my hometown, which is Palo Alto. Of course, obviously you're very familiar with Palo Alto because we played there a ton. And I used to go on weekends to commute back to Palo Alto to see my girlfriend at the time. And on one of those weekends in January of 1994, I attended a friend of mine's birthday party, who was turning, I guess, 20 or 21 at the time. I think he was turning 20. And one of our mutual friends had been introduced to Magic about a month beforehand. I'm not sure how, but he brought 2 starter decks of Unlimited as a birthday present for my friend, who was the birthday boy. And he brought his own collection, and 4 of them sat on the floor of the birthday boy's bedroom at his house, and started playing a game of Magic, a 4-way game of Magic, while I kind of watched from the sidelines. And they were playing and playing and playing, and I had no interest in it at all, zero, because we had all these outdoor activities planned. We were planning on playing, I don't know, capture the flag. We had like physical activities planned outdoors. I think Ultimate Frisbee possibly. And the game was just dragging on and on and on and on. It went on for over an hour. And finally, after they finished their first game and started playing another one, I kind of said, all right, well, maybe I should try it myself. So I convinced one of my friends to go downstairs and play an introductory game of Magic with me on a kitchen table in my friend's kitchen. And I won my first game of Magic, and I felt like there was something here. Like it immediately resonated with me. Something clicked, and I was really interested in it. So I didn't have a lot of money at the time, but I went down to a local comic store called Comics and Comics in South Palo Alto. Do you remember where California Avenue is?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. There's basically two main downtowns in Palo Alto, in the north and the south. And I guess the southern downtown is California Avenue.
Yeah.
And Comics and Comics was there, and they just happened to have unlimited starters when almost no stores had them, which was a real stroke of luck, actually, in retrospect, because at that point, nearly the whole world was sold out of Magic product. It was almost impossible to find.
Wow.
But I bought 2 starters, and in one of the first starter, I got a Royal Assassin, which was a really, really big deal. Royal
Sick.
Assassin was one of the first 2 made, long before anyone cared about Black Lotus. Royal Assassin was one of the 2 cards you really, really wanted to get. Yeah, that and Shivan Dragon, of course. And I took my cards, and I went back to Santa Cruz, and my first thought was, I need to show this to my really, really good friend, this guy named Matt Wallace, who I don't think you ever met, actually. I don't know if you ever met Matt.
Doesn't sound familiar.
Well, Matt and I met playing competitive Street Fighter. So we were friends in the context of playing Street Fighter together. And I knew that based on Matt's analytical mind and his general gaming skills, that he would really, really love Magic too. And so I introduced him to the game. As expected, he totally loved it. And most importantly, he had disposable income and a car. Critical. I didn't have a car. I didn't even have a driver's license. So I was really, really limited in my ability to move around, which was a problem because at the time it was so difficult to even find cards anywhere on Earth. It was so tough to find them. People had them in their collections and you could trade, but people were really reluctant to trade because there was no defined value for anything. So there was no universal agreement about what anything was worth. And people would very frequently do trades and then find out that they had been totally ripped off and felt taken advantage of. I certainly was guilty of on the receiving end of those kinds of transactions numerous times. And but Matt had a car, so we could drive around. We could drive around the Santa Cruz area. We could go south all the way down to Gilroy, doing anything to try to get cards. And meanwhile, we were just working on frantically just building deck after deck after deck after deck after deck. And the origin story for the term "the deck," because a lot of people that term has endured for now 26 years to present day. There's an archetype that's probably it's certainly one of the top 3 most prominently and frequently played archetypes in the current version of decks from that era. Are you familiar with Old School or 1993, 94?
I know the newer version, they call it Keeper or something like that. Is that right?
Well, Keeper, I wouldn't go so. The Keeper was basically the East Coast version of the Control archetype developed by a group of players there, I think kind of spearheaded by a guy named David Mills. But the other people,
the name, yeah.
Yeah, the other people who were sort of associated with that play group were a guy named Peter Lyer, a guy named Donnie Gallitz, but most famously Mike Long, the infamous Mike Long, pro Magic player from that era, obviously Hall of Fame candidate who has been rebuffed by the Hall of Fame countless times. There's obviously its own set of controversy about that. Mike Long, clearly the most accomplished Magic player on the planet who is not in the Magic the Gathering Pro Tour Hall of Fame. But anyway, those guys developed their own version of Control. And
let's go back to your topic. Yeah,
that's just so we'll digress and go back to the original of the deck. So the original deck that earned the moniker the deck was co-developed by Matt and me for running in the run-up to an event that was held, I think, in May of 1994. A huge tournament held in San Francisco called Manifest, and I guess Manifest, that was the first time that Manifest had been held specifically for Magic, because obviously in May of 1993, the game hadn't come out yet. So in the run-up to the event, Matt and I had been really working frantically for, at that point, I guess 3 or 4 months we were doing nothing else as we were college students, but we were really doing nothing else but just playing Magic all day long and trying every sort of thing. And we had run the gamut of all these different strategies. We had built a deck around land destruction. It was called the Land Destruction deck. We had built a deck around Chain Lightning and Lightning Bolt and Sonic Blast and Black Vice and Stormseeker that we called the Direct Damage deck. And we had built the Protection deck, which was basically just a bunch of circles of protection and moats and abysses, and basically trying to build this crazy fortress that just locked your opponent out of the game. And then we had built the Permission deck, which was a mono blue thing that just had every counterspell that we owned. And we had tried all these different iterations, but gradually began to figure out these sort of fundamental underlying mechanics in Magic that kind of came up over and over and over again in our testing. Certainly it indicated that color blue had a big advantage over all the other colors in the game. Yeah. That was readily apparent fairly early on, but we weren't weren't quite sure of exactly what it was. We couldn't really put our finger on it. But what I started to notice was that in game after game after game that Matt and I played, the person who wound up drawing the most cards throughout the game tended to win. It wasn't a certainty, but if you drew more cards than your opponent, you tended to win the game, and it didn't really tend to matter how you accomplished that goal. And so to further that aim, we really started focusing on things that dealt directly with the card advantage, as it came to be known, the card advantage aspect of the game. Either drawing more cards than your opponent or making your opponent discard lots of cards. Because we actually were able to sort of make the mental leap that cards, it's sort of analogous to poker about how money you save on a bet is the same thing as money earned. They're interchangeable. And in Magic, it's not exactly that cut and dry, but making your opponent discard is almost as powerful as drawing extra cards.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's way more powerful depending on the timing. Card drawing is more consistently powerful throughout the game, but discard is overwhelmingly powerful at the start of the game before your opponent gets a mana based and gets fortified in the game. They're actually able to do anything. And at the time, there were 2 key cards that were unrestricted based on the restricted list of the day. And they had actually, even without really having the internet, the restricted list that was curated by Wizards of the Coast had kind of made its way out into the ecosystem. And so, for example, the Black Lotus at that point was understood as a restricted card. So were the Moxes. But there were 2 huge outliers. One of them was the Library of Alexandria, which is an absurd land. It's not the most powerful land ever printed because they made some crazier lands later. But in the context of the game of the day, it's easily the strongest. It's probably the purely strongest card in the format, period. At least in terms of raw power. I don't think it's the best card, and that's sort of a semantic debate between the best and the strongest.
Do you remember your nickname for it?
What was it?
You called it the cheater card.
Yeah, I mean, you call it whatever you want. I mean, to this day, I have mostly a hate relationship with the card. I can't stand it, honestly, because I find it more than anything in the contemporary version of constructed Magic from that era, which I mentioned before is called old school or 93, 94 Magic. The Library of Alexandria is still a ubiquitous problem. It's in most decks, and it counterfeits a sizable portion of games. It just shows up and one person just runs away with the game from turn 1 while the other person just watches them draw 2 cards a turn. But the card basically, it taps to add 1 generic mana. It was known as colorless mana back in the day. And its secondary ability is that if you have exactly 7 cards in hand, you can tap the Library of Alexandria to draw another card. And because consistently the most important thing you do every single turn in a game of Magic is draw that card at the beginning of the turn, this singular land allows you to take 2 turns to every one of your opponent's 1 turns, which is just absolutely ridiculous in general, and particularly for the cost of a single land drop. It barely costs you anything to even include it in your deck. So Library was unrestricted. You could play with 4 copies in your deck at the time. And then on the opposite side of the coin, there was a black sorcery called Mind Twist, which was an initial black mana to start, and then whatever additional mana you invest in the card are random cards that your opponent has to discard. So early in the game, if you go turn 1, land, Soul Ring, Black Lotus, you Mind Twist them for 4 on the first turn. They only start with 7 cards. They lose 4 of them at random. That could be all of their resources. You know, they kept a great hand that has 3 land in it, and you Mind Twist away all 3 land. They literally can do nothing. So getting back to what I was saying about how discard at the beginning of the game is overwhelmingly strong. Well, Mind Twist was unrestricted too. You could play with 4 copies of that as well. So Matt and I put together this deck that had 4 Libraries of Alexandria and 4 copies of Mind Twist and 4 copies of Mana Vault, which was also unrestricted at the time, a 1 mana artifact that you can, as a one-time thing, can tap it to make 3. So it puts you 2 mana ahead of where you currently are. So 4 Mana Vaults, 4 Mind Twists, 4 Libraries. The rest doesn't even really matter. So many of the games you would just hand destroy your opponent utterly on the first, like turn 1 or turn 2. You would take almost all the cards out of their hand. Meanwhile, you'd be drawing 2 or 3 cards a turn because you could play multiple libraries. And you would bury the opponent almost immediately in this avalanche of card advantage and discard. And so we put this deck together, and it was so overwhelmingly insane. None of the people in our play group in Santa Cruz wanted to play against it. Matt, and all the test games that Matt and I played against it, nothing could even touch it. It was absolutely invincible. And lacking a particular way to describe what it was doing, we had made the direct damage deck, the protection deck, the land destruction deck. And we just said, let's just call this thing the deck, because that's what it is. It's just the deck. This deck is just, it beats everything, and there's no real superlative to describe it. And about 2 or 3 weeks later, Manifest happened. Matt actually went, because we didn't have, between us, we didn't have 8 libraries of Alexandria and 8 mind twists. We only had like 5 and 6. We decided that one of us would take the deck to this event to represent our brain trust. And we rolled a 20-sided die to see who would go, and Matt won the die roll. So he went to Manifest and, as expected, destroyed everyone in the entire event. Undefeated through the entire event. Like, I don't know how many rounds, because it was a gigantic event, 12 or 13 rounds, destroyed every single person quite effortlessly, and won the event, which was a big deal. But then a really big turning point happened shortly afterward. Matt decided that he wanted to leave UC Santa Cruz because he had an opportunity to go work in the pretty much brand new internet service provider industry, which was springing up in the Bay Area. And he's a really technically savvy guy, and he was offered a really, really good position at a brand new startup, an ISP, I think called Netcom at the time. And so he dropped out of Santa Cruz and went to go work at Netcom, and he left me to my own devices. And right afterward, in the summer of 1994, both Library of Alexandria and MindTwist got restricted. So the deck, as it stood, the version that Matt and I had built together, was now obsolete. And I was left basically in a position where I wanted to try to recreate that dominance, to kind of recreate that overwhelming effect. And so I started looking around among the other cards that were available at the time for things that could actually replicate that effect. And I touched on the 2 cards, Disrupting Scepter and Jam Tome, which nobody had used up to that point, really, and decided that those 2 cards would kind of form the backbone of my strategy. And I had been fine-tuning it as well, removing creatures and doing a bunch of things. And singularly, on my own, over the span of the next 2.5 months, 3 months, developed what really became the deck as it propagated virally through the entire Magic world. Shortly after an event called, I think it was called Dundracon. Yeah, I believe it was called Dundracon, which took place a little bit after the summer. It was right after The Dark came out. It was like a couple of weeks after the set The Dark came out. But I took the deck in its version to Dundracon and won the event. And nobody had seen, and it was a huge event, 512 entrants or something, 2 days of 256 person. I think it was single elim. It was nuts. I don't even think it was Swiss. But anyway, steamrolled through the whole event, and there were 2 Wizards of the Coast representatives at that event to sort of oversee it, because it was one of the biggest Magic events that had ever happened. And after I won it, they came over and wanted to talk to me about the deck that I was using. And they could not believe that it only had 2 Sarah Angels as its win conditions and a Brain Geyser. They just were utterly astonished. Nobody had ever seen a deck like that was that consistent, that could win over and over and over again in such a deterministic fashion with only 2 real ways to win the game. And so they interviewed me about it, and shortly afterward, the first mentions of the deck began to go viral on the Usenet at the time. It started to become a subject of discussions. I had a really good friend of mine who you may know, may remember his name. Do you remember Paul Pantera?
Name sounds familiar. I don't.
He was sort of like the first, because Paul Pantera worked for Sun Microsystems, and he was connected to the internet in the early days. You know, he was really big and active on the Usenet, and he also had one of the first websites that sold Magic cards, a place called collectmart.com, which mattered a few years later when I actually worked for them for about a year. But anyway, Paul was sort of the original evangelist for Bay Area Magic on the internet. So he went online, and his posts, I've read them recently, actually, they're atrocious. They're so arrogant. It's unbelievably, like, not even a shred of humility. This is like, bow down, motherfuckers. Like, we have solved Magic in the Bay Area, and none of you are worthy. None of you understand the game. You're all peons and morons. We've totally solved this game. This is the best deck in the world. Nothing beats it. And if you're not playing this, you're a moron. That's kind of what he was saying in his Usenet posts, essentially. So obviously it was very controversial, but of course people, the natural impulse when they hear that is, oh yeah, well, I'm going to challenge you then, right? Build your deck and show you how you're wrong. And of course, once everyone constructs this thing, they realize, Jesus Christ, this really is true. It just beats everything. Because at the time, what the deck fundamentally did was just so advanced compared to where everybody else was in terms of their fundamental understanding of Magic, that nothing really could objectively compete with it, and couldn't for many years, actually. In fact, I'd say that it wasn't until Ice Age came along that there really was a kind of viable way to play Magic besides Control in what at the time was called Type 1. But and then different pockets of players, the country and the world, developed their own spins on this concept, and that's where Keeper came along. So the New England guys presumably saw this deck list and thought that it could be accomplished in a different way. They probably said, well, why use creatures at all? Because their deck had no creatures. The reason why it was called Keepers, because they would kill you with Millstone.
Millstone, yeah, I figured. Yeah.
And they had a card called Elemental Augury, which was printed in Ice Age. And with Elemental Augury, you could
deny.
you look at the top 3 cards of either library and you can reorder them. So with Augury and Millstone, you can pretty much guarantee your opponent draws nothing but mana for the rest of the game. Okay. So that's why it would keep you in that position indefinitely while you kind of just watch your deck get ground to nothing.
So, I'm West Coast. I support you. This is even before I entered the story. So keep going. This is awesome.
Yeah. So anyway, and then basically, I think in 1995 or 1996, it had to have been 1995. One of the very first Magic-related websites, the Magic Dojo, came along.
I remember. Yeah.
For its day, the Magic Dojo was the source of everything related to Magic. There was no place on Earth where there was more kind of consolidation of theory, strategy, deck construction, tournament reports, card analysis, kind of everything related to the game was all consolidated on that website. And there was a guy named Rob Hahn, who I think he was just an undergrad. He might have been a graduate student out back east. And I don't remember where Rob Hahn came from. Really, really nice guy. And he put together this sort of transformational essay that he called The Schools of Magic, which you probably read. And he summarily edited it and revised it in the subsequent years. But the Schools of Magic article basically tried to outline the kind of fundamental, almost like martial arts, is what his analogy was like. But he had basically there were 3 or 4, it might have been like 4 or 5 pillars of Magic that kind of, these decks sort of encapsulate specific ideas that are more deep and fundamental underlying archetypes in Magic. So he had like a deck that was demonstrative of sort of the weenie aggro concept. He had the land destruction deck. He had the put out big creatures and disrupt their hand version deck. And then of course he had the consummate control deck personified in the deck itself. And he had names ascribed to each one of these deck types as well. So there was the Handelman deck, the Masonette deck. This predated the famous Sly deck, of course, which was kind of the really big viral, the original aggro deck, certainly red-based aggro deck. And then, of course, there was the deck, which was associated with my name. So it was the Rob Hahn's article, Paul Pantera's advocacy, and the kind of confluence of all those things that really thrust my name, the sort of Weisman name, and attached to this deck, to the forefront of Magic's propagation on the early internet around the whole world. So my name was always sort of inextricably linked to that, and people always sort of associated my name with this archetype going all the way into the present.
I was more of a dilettante during that time, so I would hear word of mouth. So like when I went to Superstars, like John Sasso would mention it, like Ilya Balin, Jeff Simino, and I'm recently in contact with Roger Ver, so shout out to him. He's
I guess you mentioned that you were talking about Roger in a podcast from a couple of days ago. Or
yeah, we're gonna do one of it anyway. So I heard Roger from. He made a pro tour, man. He made a pro tour. But I heard about you through them, not like the dojo. And I think by the time I saw the dojo, it was already reasonably developed. And I did see your name there, but I think I had already met you before I even saw your name on there.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we overlapped like crazy, right? I mean, we were playing in the same place because I was at UC Santa Cruz through, I want to say like mid 1995. And then I took a leave of absence because Magic was just consuming all my time and it was just incompatible with continuing to go to school. And then I lived in the Bay Area. I was actually living in Cupertino, and I was living with my friend Matt Wallace, the guy who went to work for Netcom. He and I were roommates, but he wasn't playing Magic anymore at all. He barely even had a collection. He had completely left the game behind and did not care about it. But I was playing full time. Yeah. Do you remember, what was the place called?
You've been to Way St. Sweet. Yes. Wrinkle in Time. I never went there, but I heard about it. But there was also a place to play.
And of course, a place. Yeah. Who could forget a place to play, right? That was
I was in Palo Alto, so I didn't go to the San Jose location that often, but I went to Match Play, which became Neutral Grounds.
Yeah. Well, and that was the place in Mountain View.
Yeah.
That place that was at the San Antonio Shopping Center, which really kind of became the nexus of Magic once places like a place to play and Wrinkle in Time closed down, which was a few years later.
So I don't remember the articles so much. I mean, I know I've read articles that you've written and, the dojo stuff, but really it's just like interactions with you. The very first time I got wrecked by that version of the deck. And then that's what, really burst my thinking process in a scope of like, I'm sure months. I just got to, a lot better. I don't really know or care where I stood. But it was like, I started entering the Pro Tour qualifiers and doing much better after, interacting with you.
Yeah, well, Magic, it's interesting because one of the things that I always advocate for, and when people ask me how to get better at Magic in general, one of the things that I really advocate for, I actually have a YouTube channel that I've been curating now for, God, like 7 years.
Well,
That's,
we'll link to it.
yeah. I mean, it has low subscriber count. It's like a little over 2,000. I've never ever worked to promote it in any way. I've had it promoted because of podcasts and interviews and stuff I've done over the years, but I've never really gone out of my way. And I certainly don't produce. I have certainly not earned a big subscriber base because I barely produce any content for it. But it consists entirely of almost entirely, 99% or more of 1v1 games of the format called Commander played online on Magic Online, replete with commentary. So basically, I'll have a session where I play Magic Online for a couple of hours, playing just random games with usually a mixture of decks or one specific deck against random opponents. And occasionally, one of those games will be quite interesting for one reason or another. Usually because my opponent gets a very fast start. They draw a bunch of early fast mana, and I'm really far behind. And it's a tough game that I have to make a lot of very careful decisions, and then hopefully can turn the game around and figure out a way to win when woefully behind. And when that happens, what I'll do is I go back, and unfortunately, Magic the Gathering Online is so poorly programmed and such a dinosaur that it has tons of endemic bugs. One of the worst bugs, particularly for content creators, is that when you play a game of Magic Online, the program saves an archive of that game on your hard drive, but the saving process is imperfect, to the point where what will often happen is that a particular card you may draw a card, or your opponent might draw a card, and for some reason there's it's almost like a DNA transcription error. The code of the card that's associated in the internal database with what that card is supposed to be will get screwed up by a digit or a letter, and so you'll draw a card in the game that you never drew. You'll draw a mana drain, what was a mana drain, but it gets, instead of being A1C2, it's A1C3, which is like a 6 mana creature. So you'll see in the game, like, you draw a 6 mana creature. Later on in the game, when you try to play the mana drain, of course, the replay tries to have you play a mana drain, but it's a 6 mana creature. It doesn't know what to do, and the replay gets stuck permanently. So it's been very frustrating doing this process for years, because I'll have some amazing game, and I'm like, this is amazing. I can't wait to go and publish this. And I'll start going through the game, and 6 turns in, I draw a card that I never drew, and then the replay is hopelessly broken. So despite that, I've still managed to post around 400 videos or so. And the whole purpose of that channel, and this relates to what I was saying before about how people approach me through email all the time with questions, or on YouTube comments and stuff about ways to improve. The primary thrust of the channel, entertainment obviously is a component of it, but I really go out of my way to try to educate. I'm really trying to use it as a teaching tool as well, because it can often be the best way to teach someone about how to think strategically and think ahead in the game, and thinking of the range of all the things your opponent can do, and really being very goal oriented with regards to how you play a game of Magic too, which is something that I think a lot of people don't really consider. They're working towards the sort of more superficial goals that exist in a game of Magic. Like, I'm going to try to preserve my life, so I'm going to try to kill the opponent. But there's so many other larger goals that are going on within that framework that you really should be focusing on. And when you're focused on those goals, the other stuff just sort of happens automatically by extension of doing the right things. This is sort of like the fundamental strategy of why the deck works. Because
I'll be a testament to this, because like, that's each of the sessions that we played together back in the day, you would like tell me something, and it must be like, some god telling some peon, because like I remember how bad I was, so it must have been like really frustrating for you, but you were trying to like communicate information. And then at some point I got like, relatively, competent, but it's just a testament.
Yeah, you're a super smart person, and you're also a great gamer. So a lot of that stuff would sort of just naturally click in your head quite quickly. And I revised and changed my teach. I'm sure that back when, you met me when I was in my early 20s, I was a great deal less patient and
Yes,
probably,
but at the same time, it was very obvious that you meant well. And I recount these stories. Like I was in a Type 1 tournament, and I like when I mention people, like, say you, like people think I'm like name dropping, but I'm more of just like tributing, like that you had a big impact on my
well,
development.
there's a difference between an homage and simply just sort of cynically using someone's name in an effort to
Yeah.
promote yourself, right? They're very different things. And I totally get that. And I certainly appreciate the advocacy. Um, and I've run into plenty of people over the years who have said sort of similar things. You remember Chris Cade, I imagine.
Yes, I remember Chris Cade.
I bumped into
Prison.
Chris Cade, yeah, out of the blue at Grand Prix or Magic Fest Las Vegas last year in August. It was literally seconds after I had just won the old school event there, the old school championship, and I
I
was,
saw that on Twitter. Yeah.
yeah, it turned into a horrible debacle, but for about an hour, it was really great. And in that hour, Chris came up to me, and I hadn't seen him in forever. This guy walks up, he's got a receding hairline, and he looks like he's in his 40s, but he's familiar. And I said, "Oh my God, is that Chris Kidd? I can't believe it." And I gave him a big hug, and he was there with his son. And one of the first things he did was he told his son, he said, "This is Brian Weisman, who was instrumental in really framing my fundamental understanding of Magic and really teaching me how to play it at a deep level," which was obviously very flattering to hear. And I've heard similar things over the years from people. Obviously, I was a competitor foremost, and so because I was a competitor, it was kind of incumbent on me to try to balance teaching and advocacy for the game with also trying to kind of still keep a bit of an advantage. But I think I've learned something about myself over the years that I really do enjoy teaching. I really love it, particularly obviously in the context of Magic of things I understand well. But for example, on Saturday, I'm hosting for the first time a clinic for the sport disc golf, which is something I've been playing avidly for about 15 years. I didn't play it particularly well, I think, until more recently, but I've really, really come to understand a lot of deep and fundamental things about biomechanics and human physiology in terms of how it relates to throwing a golf disc well, and really have felt like I've given impromptu lessons to dozens of people over the last few months and felt like it was time to actually do something formal. And I really, really enjoy the process of teaching. So I think that even though I had this sort of deeply habituated behavior of um, wanting to kind of keep my secrets to myself in order to profit from them, literally monetarily, because if you remember back in the day, we played for ante and stuff,
I
and
wasn't involved in that, but
yeah, well, money drafts came later. Ante gave way to money drafts, but people always felt the compulsion, like we want to put some stakes on the outcome of the game.
yeah.
Originally, it was ante, and it wasn't ante in the conventional sense. It wasn't ante like we randomly cut each other's decks, and that's the ante. That's the
Oh,
wager.
I remember. Yeah, this is definitely after I met you, but I think it was just about the transition. You guys would like you guys would play for cards, right?
That's
You'd set
exactly
a
right.
card. Yeah.
You have a trade binder, and you'd also have an ante binder. They were often the same
Mm.
thing for a lot of people. But your ante binder, you would basically present it to your opponent, and you would look through, and you'd go, "Okay, well, I'd like to play for your Beta Tundra," and your opponent would go through your binder, and they'd go, "I know, I'd like let's play for this revised fork," which was literally an ante that I contested against a guy from Southern California, a guy named Les Douglas. Beta Tundra his Beta Tundra versus my revised fork. We ran that several times, and I won every game. And I actually still have those Beta Tundras, which is amazing. But anyway, even though obviously it was advantageous to harbor secrets, I still found that I really enjoyed kind of expressing my vision for the game and really explaining to people everything that I had learned about it. So I shared that in conversations like with people like you, also through articles, some interviews and stuff. But I mean, obviously the conduits to spread this information were very limited at the time. I didn't really start writing any articles for the internet for a while. I kind of let other people do that for me. And then gradually enough people approached me. I started doing some commentary and so on threads that people had started. And then there were a few articles, like I wrote an article for the Duelist. That's the Duelist magazine
I
was,
barely read that thing, so
yeah, I think they made about 20, 25-ish, this is just a guess, but maybe 20 to 25 issues of that magazine that they physically published in paper form. And then gradually it just moved online. It was the Duelist Online for a while. But there was an article that I wrote for that that was, I I think may have just been called the deck, or or maybe it had the word. Oh, I think it was called taking card advantage. It just jumped into my head. Let me Google that real quick. See if you can actually find it. Taking card advantage.
Yeah, so like the personal lessons basically, or the personal advice. I don't like. I think you were just trying to teach everybody, and I, just took it in. But like, I definitely got a lot. So basically, I didn't need to read the articles because they were all in your verbal lessons. You also, one thing that doesn't necessarily do you justice with these articles is you would teach me about physical tells for
Yeah.
Magic as well. So I don't know how much you want to reveal, but
Oh, I'm happy to talk about it. I mean, I've talked about it extensively in some videos that I've done more recently. A good friend of mine, his name is Daniel Chiang, and he runs a company called VintageMagic.com, which is really one of the foremost purveyors of high-end cards for the old school format.
so
A lot. Oh, go ahead.
yeah, I think like at least the way you viewed me was definitely more of like mentor student, like not as competitive probably as you had. But one of the things is, and maybe you were through with competitions. I don't remember the exact era, and this is definitely.
Definitely still very competitive.
Oh no, I mean like we're trying to win, but like I think at least what I felt the way you were teaching me was like you genuinely wanted me to get better to like move on to things. I guess I don't
Yeah.
know if this is so
No,
universal.
I think so. I honestly think that with really anybody that I dealt, I never entered into a conversation with somebody where I had some sort of overt strategy of deceiving them, of telling them things that were not correct. If I was going to have a conversation with you about magic, I'm going to lay it on the line. I'm not going to mince words, and I'm certainly not going to obfuscate what I know, because again, I have this overriding instinct to want to teach people. I mean, this relates to sort of everything, all of the communication I do in my life, even not even necessarily in the confines of magic, but I'm sort of such an intrinsically evidence-based person that I always sort of try to, anything that I say, I want to be able to provide evidence for that, for my
Yeah,
points of view and for positions that I take. And obviously, in the context of magic, if I'm going to tell you something, well, I'm certainly going to have concrete evidence to back that up. Like I can literally show you in a game right now why I'm doing this or
it
why
paid
I'm right about
off
the decision.
because what happened was you noticed a tell of mine, which is like if I had an answer to something, I would like immediately shift that card to like the left side or something like that.
Oh
And
yeah,
that came into play because when we were in a Pro Tour qualifier in the teams with Weisman and Shui, I
yep,
noticed my opponent was an extrovert and he would constantly be watching for stuff. And a lot of the stuff that you taught me like years ago when I was actually like more trying, I corrected those throughout the years. So when I noticed he was noticed like looking for stuff, I was able to manipulate the situation. And I know you commented like I had a game where I think you might have thought my play was questionable. I had explosive growth with kicker, so
okay,
I played it accordingly. In which I think at the time you thought might have been questionable, but what I didn't tell you was that my opponent was an extrovert and he was watching my hand motions.
okay,
So I did something to pretend that I didn't have the card.
I
So
see.
when I did it, and then I did like he did a bad block, in which I think you were surprised because I know you were sweating me that game. You were
Yeah,
surprised he did a certain block, and then I got him like really bad with
I
that.
see.
But so that was something that I never credited you for something you taught me like years ago, and then I executed when we were
Yeah, I mean, it
teammates.
certainly sounds like you sort of engineered that situation on your own. Perhaps you're
Yeah.
giving me too much credit for it, but I mean, that's an awesome story, and I love that. That's obviously something that's really
You gave me
missed.
a really hard time, but I remember I said I'll tell you later, but I never did.
You never did.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's always whenever you're playing on a team, right? And it's down to one guy's match, and the outcome of your team effort is contingent on whether your opponent does play perfectly, or I'm sorry, not your opponent, but your teammate plays perfectly. And it's very easy to be hypercritical of their decisions, particularly because you're not inside their head.
Yeah.
So yeah, of course, I mean, I'll admit to certainly watching both you and Euban play and being like, the fuck is
Yeah.
happening here? Like, obviously these guys are nuts, but the results do speak for themselves to an extent. Um, yeah, that was quite a team, wasn't it? I'm just was thinking about that this
We made the
afternoon.
pro tour and I punted like because well, yeah, and it's not really an excuse, but it is a rationale. Magic's like I mean, I'm Command and Conquer first, then Warcraft, then Starcraft. Magic's probably like my fourth game
Fifth
that I,
tier.
yeah,
Yeah.
fourth or fifth game. So like to me, it's like a kid in a candy store. Like I just want to learn. I'm not real. I want to win, but I'm not like, oh, this means this is like my identity. It's like something I'm very very interested in. So
I mean,
that pro tour I punted, and I remember you weren't very mad because we were kind of like, I think you were probably like 30, I was like mid 20s, and just like we're kind of over it. We're happy to be there, and of course I feel bad for punting, but like we had such a crappy card pool.
I do
And
remember that. I mean, it was such an interesting. The entire experience is really interesting, not just because of the tournament, but also because of the historical framing around that event, which is a crazy story in its own right. I don't know how much you remember. Do you remember when that tournament was? I, I, I would
it
be
has to be
I would be shocked
2000.
if you didn't remember the exact date of it. That's a hint.
Oh, was it right around 9/11?
It was the weekend before.
Oh my
It was
god.
literally the weekend before. The tournament, 9/11, the 9/11 attacks happened on Tuesday morning, September 11th, 2001.
Wow.
We played on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday on September, whatever that is, 7th, 8th, and 9th of that year in New York City at Madison Square Garden. That's where our event, that's where the tournament was. It was in New York City the weekend
This
before the biggest terrorist attack in US history in New York.
wow.
Yeah,
It's coming back to me now. Yeah.
yeah, on Monday, I flew out. I was scheduled to fly out of New York City on Monday night, and I spent Monday afternoon touring the city, taking pictures of the World Trade Center from the deck of the Empire State Building. It's in the background, like less than 24 hours away from being destroyed. And the craziest thing too is that I was um, scheduled to fly, I think around 9 p.m. on Monday night, going from New York City out of I think it was LaGuardia Airport, because there's three. There's
Yeah.
Newark and LaGuardia, and
Yeah.
two of the three airports had hijacked planes that left from them.
Gosh.
I think LaGuardia and JFK had hijacked planes, and Newark was not affected. And I believe that I was flying out of the airport that did not have hijackers in it. But on Monday night, when I was due to fly out, I left Manhattan in a taxi and drove, I remember, across the Brooklyn Bridge. And as we were driving, this gigantic torrential thunderstorm blew in. A really, really intense thunderstorm came in, late, I guess, early fall, late summer thunderstorm, blanketed the city in lightning and thunder and wind, and obviously deluged the airport. And we're sitting around in the airport and getting closer and closer and closer to the time to leave. And it's very apparent that the flight is not going to take off in a thunderstorm. So they delayed the flight for an hour. They delayed the flight for another hour. It's now like 10:30 at night. Flight still hasn't left. This is Monday night on September 10th, 2001. They come over the loudspeaker and they finally announce that the flight has been canceled and it's going to be moved to the following morning. And so they ask everybody who's on the flight to go up to the little desk to check in to see about accommodations and possibly to get rescheduled to fly out of a different airport the following morning. And one of the flights that they were recommending that we take the following morning was out of JFK, a flight from New York to California out of JFK, which is literally what one of the hijacked planes was, the
Wow.
following morning on September 11th. And so I remember going over to the payphone and calling my girlfriend's brother, who we were staying with at the time, and saying, we need to come back. We're going to spend the night in Manhattan and go back tomorrow morning to fly out. And while I was on the phone, I noticed a bunch of people kind of rush back to the desk. And so I put the phone down and went over, and they said that, well, the storm has cleared temporarily. There's a big hole in the clouds, and we're going to let some flights out, including yours, so you guys can leave. So we flew out. We left at about midnight on the morning of September 11th, like at 12:30 in the morning, and
God.
landed in California at whatever 5 o'clock in the morning or something, and got back. And within a couple of hours, got phone calls from people that were panicking about the fact that we had just flown back from New York to California. Yeah, so we were,
Wow.
yeah, incredibly, incredibly. I mean, obviously the flight might have been different. There's no way to really know in retrospect. But as far as getting extremely close to that calamity without actually being in it, we got damn close. But that was the last pro tour that I played in. It was that team event with you two guys. And
It was
yeah, we got a bad card pull. I feel like we weren't prepared though. Like we just didn't practice at all.
no, we did like we were all busy. Like I don't remember what you were doing. I know you were hardcore busy. Hui had a job. I would like I remember the event and I know what intense things were going on through my life. So I spent a lot of like when these team events and I qualify with Hui St. Shui and Steve Aldrich, rest in peace Steve Aldrich the year
Yeah,
after.
remember that.
And like I'm the one who kind of dilettante prepares and then I kind of give you guys intel what I think and then I think you guys are more solid and veterans and more into the game. So then you kind of like set the tone. I think when we were getting our card pool, you were the one basically
Building,
distributing.
yeah,
Yeah.
building the decks. I remember, I definitely remember that at the qualifier, that I kind of went through everything and you guys kind of just deferred to me. And that's probably honestly almost the best way to do it.
Yeah.
Because if you don't do it that way, I don't even know if team events are a thing anymore, but if you ever play in a team event, it's way better to just sort of delegate that responsibility to one person, because otherwise you get this problem where you have two people, like two of the other guys are vying for, like, no, no, I really want that in my deck. Like, give that to me, because they want to be winning more. But that's not the objective. You need to make three strong decks that
And
are
a
a seven,
testament.
that
Yeah.
are 7 out of 10, rather than 110, 1 9, and 1 4.
So a testament to you too is like it's not like you hoard all the good cards. You really do try to allocate like the best chances to win. And I probably have the most like street personality out of all three. So I could play anything, but aggro decks like I'll try to figure something out because I'm more experienced with those. So I think you
Yeah,
knew like what to. I don't remember the exact cards, but you did some micromanaged choices where you're like, this would be good for Wayne's deck, and then they actually did come up. I don't remember what. It was one of the cards was Repulse. Like
mm,
you were playing blue white, you obviously Repulse is an amazing card. It would be great for you. And then I was playing 5-color green, and
yep.
you forced me to splash for Repulse, and you were very insistent because I remember saying, no, 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 it's okay. Repulse is an amazing card. Let's give it the blue white deck. You're like, no, 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 trust me, and it did come into play like many
Yeah,
games.
totally. Yeah, the card was completely insane in that
But
archetype.
I'm splashing for it, and 5-color green in Invasion, blue's not really the crucial of a color for a
Yeah,
splash.
because it doesn't have any of the fixing. Like, obviously the green is all I mean, it has like a couple of weird janky fixers, but they're, God, that was
It
such an incredible block. Do you remember what happened though about how I misregistered the deck and I left two cards off of my list? It was
I
Emblazoned
vaguely
Golem
remember.
and a Vindicate. I don't know how the fuck I remember this. Like, when did we qualify? 2000, 2001,
2000
19
or
years ago, in the
2001.
qualifier.
Yeah.
And I remember, like, third round in or something, they did random deck checks and they looked at my list, and I just randomly left two of my best cards off my list. Emblazoned Golem and Vindicate were just not on my list. I did not record them, and I don't know how. I
Mm-hmm.
think they got lumped in with lands or something. So
Mm.
I had to start, I got a game loss, and I had to start every first game with two basic lands and two of my best cards in my sideboard. And
And we still won.
I still went undefeated somehow. Yeah. I mean, I guess the other whatever 15 cards I was playing with were pretty damn good.
They were. I remember you had Fact or Fiction, but just like, yeah, I mean, it's really good memories. And
It
like
would have been 21 cards, actually. Yeah.
you mentioning the 9/11 things, like it's crazy because like now that I think back, and there's so many things that have like happened. Like I've been there for like a lot of historical things that, which is cool because now I'm on broadcast and doing podcasts that bring up. We'll get into one in a bit, but definitely this event was just like cool because I do remember the misregister, but it's just like you being way known each other for quite a long time, and uh, it was just cool. I feel like it was for people who moved on from Magic or whatever. I just finished competing in StarCraft, so it was a really painful process to me because it like real time games meant so much to me, and it was a time where I'm just like I can't do this anymore. Like I'm
What
gonna
was,
get slower, and the money's not there. I had my fun. It's time to get back to real life.
was it just the APM thing that really pushed you away from it? Or was the fact that it was just, at the time, there was no way to leverage being great at StarCraft into actually having a career?
No, at that time, there was a chance to move to South Korea
I
to.
remember we talked about that, yeah. Because South Korea, like a decade ahead of its time with esports, they actually had a real thing going on there already.
It was really complicated. Obviously, me being Asian, it already wasn't kosher, even though it's just like I was in like the Mercury News, I was in Wired. I was paying for everything. I had a job like being the pioneer of StarCraft esports,
Yeah.
like to the public and a competitor.
But he
And
still had his career pressure from family.
that was one of the factors, but the .com boom was coming on. So the company was changing more towards like a gaming portal. It bad timing, maybe the product wasn't a fit. I know Dennis Fong went on to do other great things, and just like I transferred into from content creation to programming, and it just feels like a shift because like I was like, if I'm not going to move to South Korea, it's time to put an end to this chapter.
I see. What year
But
was that?
it was 2000. Like I stopped competing at the end of 1999, the World Championships, where I got third place, and then the end of that year, I just made that determination that I I just decided that I put a close to it.
I see.
So and I cold turkey gaming for I had a girlfriend at the time, and I cold turkey for like quite a bit, but it's in our blood. So like
It turns
so
out that it's good. It turns out that it's very good to have it in your blood, I think.
which we're going to talk about more extensively, and what the inspiration for this podcast is basically what happens to these competitive gamers like later on in life, because often the stereotype is like gamers are losers or whatnot, and even in talk shows like Jimmy Kimmel or something, it just like, or even Joe Rogan, who I mean I like both of those guys, and they just like rip on gaming, and it's just like,
Yeah, I found that I saw just a little glimpse of that. I found it to be incredibly irresponsible and just so arrogant and needlessly condescending.
yeah. So it's tough because like, and the gamers that Jimmy Kimmel had on the show, it's like they were so apparent, like they felt similar like to me, at least me, where like I like Jimmy Kimmel, I enjoy his show, and for him to like say these things is like,
Very jarring.
yeah, it's just like I don't want to say anything bad about Jimmy Kimmel or Joe Rogan, because I admire their product, but it really like makes me put a wall up now in distance and be like, oh well, I better take care of myself.
Yeah. Well, people are. I mean, people are complicated, right? This speaks to a larger issue that I think is very pervasive in the country right now, particularly with regards to politics. And obviously, I think we should eschew politics for the most part. But I think that
Yeah.
one of the fundamentally underlying deep problems in the country right now is this idea of tribalism and the fact that if you're a member of the tribe, you don't question the orthodoxy or the leader of that tribe, no matter how contemptible and reprehensible that person actually is. And so, with regards to your feelings towards both Jimmy Kimmel and Joe Rogan, like, you can be part of Team Joe Rogan, you can be in the Rogan, the Rogan podcast tribe. And I'm sure that Rogan's podcast has been very inspirational to you and very
Oh,
instructional as
very,
well.
yeah.
Tremendously,
So
right? So it's very hard to look at him and say, okay, well, I admire this guy and what he's accomplished, and he's a tremendously good model for what I might like to aspire to. But then he's saying this completely outrageous shit that's so ignorant that it's really hard for me to, I can't really jive those two ideas in my mind. It's hard for me to really, but that's really okay. And I think it's important to recognize the fact that it's okay to really be a fan of somebody while at the same time being critical of specific positions that they hold. Nuance is fine. Like, we get that. Smart people understand nuance. You don't need to be tribal. You don't need to doggedly just adhere to a specific person to the point where you won't criticize them. That's actually it's not even doing them a favor. People need to be called out when they say stupid shit. If I was friends with Joe Rogan, I would say to him, dude, what the hell are you doing? That's incredibly irresponsible. There's tens of millions of people who love and listen to your podcast who are avid gamers. What are you doing, man? Like, this
I
position is obviously wrong. It's just objectively wrong.
I put up a kind of a wall, and kind of like I'm still a fan of him, but like my narrative, especially this conversation, is more for people who are like teenagers that need to hear that if they're avid gamers, they don't even have to be like elite competitors. If you're elite competitors, you're going to find a way. But even if you're pretty strong, pretty bright guy, you could turn your life into great things. But narratives like Jimmy Kimmel or Joe Rogan that make you sound like you're going to be a loser, that's just like not true.
Objectively not true. And it just does make them sound ignorant. One of the things that I've always said is something that I've really tried to define my life by, no matter what it is that when I choose to do something, I just take it seriously. I think that's a mantra that you can adhere to. This is something that I've tried to really, really I have a 10-year-old son. His name is Desmond. He's 10 and a half.
Shout
And
out to
one of the
Desmond.
things I've tried to instill in Desi is this idea that take the things you do seriously, give
Just
them the
go.
respect that they deserve. That when you treat something with respect, when you treat obviously other people with respect and their views about the things that they do with respect, the net benefit is gigantic. And respect, fundamentally respecting something is so instrumental to understanding it as well, to understanding the perspective of people who enjoy it. Jimmy Kimmel and Joe Rogan's perspective on gaming was obviously very overtly and needlessly disrespectful of that activity. It's the idea that this is an activity that I don't understand, that I don't partake in. Therefore, those who do it are not worthy of my respect. They're only worthy of my derision. And that's just such an obviously wrong and ignorant way to view your fellow man and the world in general. But when it comes to just things in general, like gaming endeavors or whatever it is you do it with passion, do it with respect, and really take it seriously, no matter what it is. If you're in a PE class and the coach asks you to go run a quarter mile, or he asks you to do sit-ups or square dancing or whatever the hell they're out asking kids to do in PE classes, take it seriously. Just do it. It doesn't hurt you to take something seriously. People may mock you, but those people, the people that don't take shit seriously in their lives, they
They're
will
not
almost
gonna.
consistently end up in a position doing something that they hate. When you take your life seriously, when you take everything that you do with and you give it a degree of respect and you really throw your intelligence and your work ethic and your discipline into it, also taking stuff seriously gives you the opportunity to find out whether it really is a passion or not, whether you are in fact good at it. If you never take anything seriously, you can never find out that you even have any aptitude at it at all. You'll never really even discover that this might be the thing that you're meant to do, because you just treated it with insincerity and with a lack of respect. Gaming is
So
certainly true in that way.
yeah, so that's something that I noticed recently in the last few years. I didn't know I had certain abilities. Like, and I'm like middle aged, man. I'm like 42. Like, I was tasked to do game design, which I don't study, but I played so many games and been competitive in them. Like,
Yeah.
intuitively was able to come up with stuff, and I'm gonna have a game license in commerce. Like, we have a deal and have a patent and a patent pending so I'm just like, well, why didn't somebody just like ask me to design something? Then I would have tried.
What,
But
what was the recent design thing
it's
that
it's
you're
it's
talking
they're both casino games, and I'm in a state where we've been competitive gamers our entire lives, so I was too polarized and linear into thinking that's the way I should be living life, which is like in poker sense, scraping out every fraction of an EV.
about?
But when you're building a product, which, you're a little bit older than me and you have successful products, you know how much effort goes into it and probably understand this better than I do. Sometimes when you're building a product, you are buying time to make sure things go through versus scraping out every fraction of progress in EV. I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, the process of game development in itself is um, it evades any type of formula or recipe. I think I've had a lot of people on the backbone, and I'm sure we'll get to discussing it, but on the backbone of the success of Path of Exile, people mostly who I know through the gaming world have come up to me, and they're aspiring game designers themselves. They're ambitious. They're working a 9 to 5 job that they don't like. They want to be independent, and they want to know, what's the secret sauce? What can I do? I have an idea. I want to go out and strike out on with my own game company and try something, and I want to do something. What's the secret? What do I do? Where do I even get started? And it's such a difficult thing to communicate to people, because obviously there is certainly no formula to success. Like, for example, let's contrast that with something like someone who comes up to you and says, I want to be a professional poker player. How do I get started? Well, it's really quite easy to direct people to almost the owner's manual, the rule book on how to be a successful poker player.
Yeah.
There are multiple very, very fundamentally important steps in that process that a person needs to take the time to come to understand. If they're in fact, I mean, obviously there's no substitute to just literally throwing tens of thousands of hours at it. That's probably the best answer of all as
Yeah.
it's the answer to most things. But just like with sports practice, getting back to the disc golf clinic thing, there's two types of practice, right? There's quantity and quality. And
Yeah.
quality practice will always supersede quantity practice. You can spend thousands of hours doing a sport wrong biomechanically, and you'll never ever improve. I see
Right.
this constantly when I try to teach people how to throw a disc correctly. They've been doing it for 10 years, and they're as bad as they were in the first month. They're as good as they were the first month in. They've never improved past that point because all of their practice is quantity and none of it is quality. And so it's the same sort of thing with regards to the development of really any product and so on too. I just think that there just aren't any succinct rules to that as well. And certainly there are people who've been playing poker for 15, 20, 30 years who are horrendous. They're totally horrible. And they have no basic understanding of any of the underlying basic strategies. They run based on superstition and gut instinct. And some of those gut instincts may result in them making the correct choice occasionally, but their fundamentals are so broken, they can only really be a losing player in the long term.
My narrative was more towards like, you have a game design, you made a successful business out of it. Like I guess when you're dealing with prices and magic cards and valuations, you have a little bit of more practice than say I would, but it just like never occurred to me to when I'm building a product. Now I have to think about the financials. I have like legal bills, I have to do marketing and stuff like that. Like as I'm waiting for the game to come out, my execution is now on building a foundation. The game's changed to building a foundation in survival versus maximizing EV, in which I could hit like a point where, especially in poker, like you lose and you don't have the resources to move on to the next step, because I'm in a state where I don't know what my costs are going to be. I'm trying to reduce them as much as possible. I control enough like media, broadcast, and IP that I think I'll be fine. I'm not like the object isn't to win anymore. It's not to like take down blackjack and baccarat. It's just survive so I could reap rewards.
Yeah, I think that that's. I mean, I think that that's an excellent strategy to go into with regards to game development in general. The whole idea, if you look at game projects that come to market, a very sizable portion of them don't take into account that idea of survival enough. They basically, if you look at how they spend development money, they're so front-ended. They spend a ton of money initially, right? They get some investment money. They recruit the best staff. They overpromise to their employees in terms of stock options and things like that to get people to attract a really, really stalwart cast of people to make their game. And they overpay everybody. And then they're a year and a half into development or 2 years into development, and they completely run out of money. And so they're often put in this position where they have to do a bunch of really terrible things. First of all, they have to constrain the vision of the game. That's one of the worst things of all. That their entire idea is like 3/4 of the things that they promised. And a lot of the time, a lot of these games now are crowdfunded on things like Kickstarter and GoFundMe. And so somebody will go, there's some, I think it's called Project Entropia. There's this famous game that's been in development for 1 million years now called Project Entropia. And you want to talk about overpromise, underdeliver with that. Project Entropia has been in the pipeline for ages. And when you look at the things that they promised in that game versus what they'll likely be able to launch it with, it's going to be like 10% of the promised features will actually make it into the game, and everybody will be furious about it because they just massively overpromised and will automatically, it's inevitably under deliver when the actual game comes out. And that's obviously a huge mistake that you can make with regards to Kickstarters and stuff. So a lot of these companies start out with this grand vision, but then due to monetary reasons, they have to completely trim and prune away a lot of what they intended to do in order to actually make the game, to get into a form where it can actually release. And then so many games come out these days that are just totally unfinished. They just release a game that's not finished because they have no money left. They have no choice. What can they do? It's either close down the studio completely because they can't get any more funding, or just release the game in some hideously bugged state and just hope that enough people play it that gives you enough money to fix all the problems with it, and then eventually get it years down the line into something that resembles your actual vision.
Exactly. So this is kind of the dilemma that I was hit. So basically the way I live life plus development, it's just like it's very like lower cost, like explosive kind of things versus like I need to optimize. Like I clearly in year one of execution, I'm like, if I optimize this, I'm screwed. There's no way I can sustain these costs, even though I know what the smartest thing to do is. So I'm just like more being, a resourceful scrapper, so to say. And that's something that um yeah, like you quantified, there's so many graveyards of these things, and maybe they could have been amazing products, but it's just not practical to aim for something like that with the amount of time, resources. And I think you have a good network, like you're really good friends. Like there's a lot of civil war in companies that just cause it to dissolve regardless of product.
Yeah, that's inevitable. I've heard plenty of Civil War stories relayed to me through by Matt, actually, by Matt Place, because Matt's actually he's worked for, I think at this point, 4 different game companies. He worked for Upper Deck originally, making, I think, the WoW TCG, and then he worked for Wizards of the Coast for about 6 or 7 years, and then he was,
Blizzard too.
yeah, and then he was, no, actually, eventually he finished at Blizzard, but he was actually he worked for a company called Direwolf Studios, a game development company based out in Colorado that for several years was working on this super secret project that he couldn't tell me about, which actually turned out to be a card game, a Hearthstone style card game based in the League of Legends IP. They
Mm,
were it was like a secret project that was funded by Riot
yeah,
to try to make, they must have known about Hearthstone because I think it was kind of going on
sure.
quietly in the background. This is when Hearthstone was still in development,
Hmm.
but basically they were developing their own digital TCG in parallel with Hearthstone, but using the Riot IP, and they couldn't say anything about it. And then they were
Of course.
developing it, and Matt was the lead on that project for several years, and then eventually, I think Hearthstone came out in beta, and the contrast between what they were developing and Hearthstone was so gigantic that Riot was rightfully concerned that their game would be a laughing stock. And they said,
Mm,
we can't really have this very rough, very primitive looking TCG associated with our brand that people will automatically compare to Hearthstone,
sure.
obviously unfavorably. And they pulled the plug on the project. They just said, okay, we're done.
Wow.
We've invested $10 million. We're going to cut our losses. We're just going to walk away from this.
Holy cow. Yeah.
Yeah. And that left, of course, the studio and all the people associated with adrift. And Matt had been promised bonuses and equity based on how well the game that he had been working on was going to do. So, getting back to what you were saying about, like infighting and stuff, there was all of this sort of civil war that went on inside the studio. I wasn't privy to too much of it. This is obviously second or third hand information, but there
Sure.
was
Yeah.
tons of infighting. And eventually he's just like, I've invested the last 3 or 4 years of my life into this thing. I can't do this anymore. And he walked away. And that's when he was subsequently hired by Blizzard. And he actually worked on Hearthstone with Blizzard for, I think, not
Right.
very long, 9 months or something. And then,
Um, yeah, go ahead.
oh, and I was just going to say, Matt was a relatively small, somewhat early investor in Path of Exile, actually, back in
Yeah.
2011. And then, so we were at the time when he was doing all the final stuff at Blizzard, we were transacting the sale of the company to Tencent,
Hmm.
and that eventually that transpired in April of 2018, so a little over 2 years ago. And Matt's share from that sale was enough to get him to leave his, his Blizzard job and move back
Blizzard's
up to
getting
Orange.
some really bad press, and I don't want to ever say bad things about Blizzard because they've obviously been integral in my
Totally.
career.
They've made some utterly amazing games that I play to
Yeah.
this day.
And yeah, I mean that's one of the stranger relations. But the thing is, a lot of my good friends that work there aren't there anymore. And I was actually interested in uh, maybe doing something for Hearthstone, but it's not gonna.
Oh, you
It's
mean actually? Yeah, I mean, you told me that you felt that you could turn pro at Hearthstone if you wanted to put in the hours.
yeah. I don't think anybody doubts that. Like to be honest, like I'm literally just like scraping by, and I hit legend every month. It's like if I did compete like 2019 Wild, which is very similar to Type One, which is why I liked
Yeah,
that format.
just all
And
stars.
yeah, I got 25th in US. Uh,
Wow, no
I
idea.
They changed the format like right before, so one of the decks that I was preparing for got outdated. But the thing is, like, I have two companies, a job, and I'm trying to compete. It's just like I was like literally dying of exhaustion when I was competing, and during round two, and thank God this digital. This was Magic the Gathering, and we're in a live setting. There's no way I could have done. I would have like fallen asleep at the table. But
Right, of
because
course.
I was at home, I was able to like rest in between and just like in a way that I wasn't as diligent with Magic, like meticulous. Like I'm trying to win, but this I'm just like I'm actually, I'm trying to. I prepared for a month. I'm trying, and then I was so paranoid and meticulous about each play
Yeah.
that I just really tried, and like I wish I know I could have performed better if I had more time, and I don't have any teammates too. That's your network is very important.
Absolutely. I can't imagine anything more important for doing well at a game like Hearthstone, where you have to be able to. It's such the constructed version of Hearthstone is so interesting because in Magic, the difference between two decks of relatively similar strategy will often be a lot of cards. It'll be 10, 15 cards sometimes. In Hearthstone, it's like one card is different in your deck, and that's a huge, enormous difference that will ripple through the whole event. You just happen to have this one, like you're running an acidic slime and somebody is, or the ooze. It's the ooze, acidic ooze, 3/2.
Ooze slime is magic. Ooze
Yeah,
is
acidic slime is a mesh. The ooze is the 3/2. They're both green, right? It's the 3/2 that destroys a weapon. But like the fact that one guy chooses to run ooze and the other guy chooses to run Harrison Ford or whatever, the thing that destroys
yeah,
a
and gets the cards. Yeah,
and draws cards, right? Like that is, it doesn't seem like that big of a difference, but that difference in deck construction can really make an entire, like that can totally change how you go through the whole event. The
yeah,
fact that one guy has the card drawing thing and he happens, like it happens to be all slow control warriors or whatever, and he's getting insane value the whole time at it because he has this one card that's different.
yeah. I agree, and like there are beautiful like I've been very public on this too. I think Magic's a more fun game. I think it's easier to play Hearthstone due to the convenience. I do think Hearthstone does a lot of things, really well, especially since you can't play during your opponent's turn, in which in Magic you can.
Right, of
Um,
course.
and secrets is like by a programming limitation is like once it's triggered, the second thing that would trigger it doesn't
Yeah, it
exist.
turns out counterspell's a lot worse when it triggers automatically the next time your opponent plays a spell versus like the best
Right.
thing in the deck.
Yeah.
The best,
So
yeah, it's a little worse.
I do want to compliment Blizzard on the getting it this far and what the product is. I do have high admiration for it, especially the convenience factor of
One
Hearthstone.
thing that I think that can't be understated too in the role of Hearthstone's success and propagation is that the game is fundamentally fun to watch, and that's the thing that really sets it apart from Magic.
Yeah,
A
I
long
agree.
time ago in this conversation, I think, I don't know, yeah, I think this came up during our recorded conversation, but I was talking about how, oh yeah, this related to the question about Scaphalias and the formulation of the Pro Tour, because if you have uh, a strong constitution, you can go on YouTube and you can look for, I don't know exactly what the search terms would be, but you can, if you dig around, you'll be able to find advertisements that were produced by Wizard of the Coast, I think around 1998, 1999. They were trying for a little while, gamely trying to promote the game through the regular channels that products were normally promoted through in the early days, well, in the age of television and pre-internet, which was through advertisements, regular video, 30-second video advertisements. You try to think of like trying to make people get excited to play Magic the Gathering in a
Mm,
30-second
whew,
spot on,
that's really
that is
hard.
a real challenge. I don't think that anyone on earth, no genius advertising executive on earth is up to that task, I think, because the game is, it's like trying to promote, chess in an advertisement. You can never do it justice. All you can do is just make it look awful, like something no one would ever want to do. And
You've
so
you've been exposed to this task for like a long time. Do you think you could do it right now, or what would be your best guess?
if I could promote Magic through video medium,
Yeah,
absolutely not. No, no, I could never do it justice. It's just impossible.
Hearthstone has a really good ad, but it's like have you seen it or what? They have a lot of ads.
I certainly have seen it, but this gets back to another point that I was going to make. And this relates to the fact that one of them is a spectator sport and one isn't. And I know that Magic Arena has sort of changed the conversation a little bit. Magic Arena is, are you familiar with it much?
I know of it. Like right now, as you know, I have way too much on my plate, and
Yeah,
something
I
like
understand.
getting a conversation with you is like literally I've been it's been on my mind for like a long time.
I see. That's cool. Well, Magic Arena came out in, I think it's, don't quote me on this. I think it's a couple years old now. But it was an attempt to make Magic aesthetically pleasing to watch, simpler to play, streamlined for online play, and also a far more enjoyable spectator experience. There's a lot more stuff is easy to discern from the perspective of a viewer in a game of Arena, and in general, the presentation is much more flashy. There's tons of animations. There's lots of cool sounds. Things smash into each other with big impact explosions. There's lots of digital effects. The spells and the fireballs cause these big roaring contrails of sparks and stuff. It looks really cool, and it's clearly an attempt to take Magic out of that staid,
Right. Yeah.
completely sterile environment that Magic Online is, right? Which is basically just meant to be a recreation of tabletop Magic,
Yeah.
and take it into the modern day so that it can stand side by side with a game like Hearthstone and look comparable. And they've done very well. Magic Arena is incredibly successful. It's easily the most successful and accessible version of digital Magic that's ever existed. Far more accessible than Magic Online, which unfortunately still has all of the warts that are attached to the regular paper game.
Right.
So the very fact that when you play game of Magic Online, literally every time I have to do anything that interacts with the stack, my opponent has to say, no, I don't want to respond. That just makes the game so cumbersome. And Magic Arena circumvents a lot of those interactions by having an intelligence about what the players have in their hand and what options are available to them at the time.
But
So
that's the thing. Like the advertising for this advertising for Hearthstone actually has very little to do with the game. So I think people, especially like us who are hardcore gamers, are too focused on the fact that we're trying to sell the game versus sell the emotion while we
yeah,
play
no,
the
that's a
game.
very valid point. I agree with you there. And I think that if there are a few famous kind of viral Magic ads that they did experiment with that I think did get some more traction. And like you said, they had absolutely nothing to do with the game at all. One of them was the famous thing where there's an org or something, and they're making a monster in a lab, and there's an org involved.
Oh, I
That's
vaguely
the
remember
famous
those.
Magic Viral. There's a guy in a lab coat and stuff. Apparently, this ad actually was quite successful, and people liked it, and it got them curious about what Magic might be.
Yeah,
But the ads that they were producing before that, the 1990s ads,
mhm.
are they are unbelievably cringy. They're
I'm sure.
so
Yeah,
bad. They're such bad ads that if I didn't know anything about Magic and I saw that ad, I would go out of my way to avoid that game, not play it, because it looks so incredibly terrible in terms of its portrayal, the way that people act in it and stuff. It's god awful. So credit SCAF with recognizing the fact that in 1996 the traditional avenues of promoting Magic the Gathering were failing. Remember, the Pro Tour had for a time they were actually broadcasting matches, top 8 matches from both nationals and from the Pro Tour on ESPN2 with commentary and editing. They brought in the guy who was associated with the X Games at the time as the voiceover guy. His name was Chris Kelly. They brought Chris Kelly into the studio to do with his cool hip gravelly voice and stuff because he was doing the X Games and some other sports and stuff. They brought Chris Kelly in to do the voiceovers and so on. The intros and outros and so on. And the commentary would generally be me and Chris Pakula, actually. And I've heard segments of that I'm 45 now. I mean, I've listened to those over the last couple of years. It's so awful. It's so grating for me to listen to. I sound terrible. Honest, objectively, I sound awful. But
uh,
even that, I mean, that obviously fell flat, right? Nobody's going to be watching ESPN2 and they're going to flip to see people playing a card game that they don't understand, and they're going to go, "Oh,
yeah,
what's this? I want to go and play Magic." It's just a terrible idea. But the Pro Tour was by far the way that they figured out to promote Magic to the masses. They could point at the Pro Tour, they could promote the Pro Tour players, and they could say, listen, if you're
good enough.
a kid at home, right, and you're 15, you can play on the Super Series, or you're 20 and you're in college or you're out of college and you've got time to devote to this game, you could go and be a world famous player, and you could win $45,000 playing in an event, which was unheard of at the time. I mean, what kind of non-sports events were paying prizes like that at the time, other than maybe
Right.
the South Korea esports events were probably paying similar amounts of money, maybe more.
It ramped up. So that one was $2,500, and then the second place one was 7K, and the top prize was 10K. So they started ramping up, that's why it was such a tough call. Like it was definitely on the plate for me to continue competing in StarCraft, but the thing is like moving to another country plus like not being able to speak the language plus like I like it could have been a fad. Like I don't think the way it was uptrending, all the
Yeah,
esports at the time were uptrending. I don't think it was gonna be a fad, but honestly, we're in America, and the Magic the Gathering has this issue too, in which like you have a lot of better options in life than being a professional gamer.
absolutely. And until Twitch TV and Twitch TV promotion of, I mean, obviously there are lots of gamers now who, because of Twitch TV, have become literal celebrities
Yeah,
who've transcended even the world of gaming. You know, take Ninja for example. You know,
right.
Ninja's playing Fortnite against Drake and LeBron James and stuff, right? Like he's like a legit celebrity from what happened with Twitch TV. So gamers have certainly they've transcended that, but that's a very recent that's a very recent event. That's only within the last couple of years that mainstream gamers have suddenly been able to be catapulted up to the same kind of level of respect and status that South Korean celebrity gamers have been enjoying for 20 years, at least
Well,
based on what I've
some
heard.
stuff is yeah, it is true, but like it's all relative too. Says like I get recognized more for poker stuff now in Live at the Bike than I did for StarCraft, but people still recognize me for StarCraft. But because because the video forum,
Of
I'm
course, you
more
have a podcast,
there.
people watch it.
Yeah, and but I'm also in LA, in which there's too many famous people. Like so, the fact that I even get recognized in the sea of like so many, like I've ran into so many celebrities
At that
in
price.
LA,
Yeah,
in LA in general. It's just not even special, I guess. It's just like as an experience, it's not that interesting. So like when Ninja does his stuff, it's like cool, but I am me personally, and this may not be universal, are more concerned about gaming as a reputation as an industry. So like when you hear League of Legends has more viewers, the World Championships has more viewers than the Super Bowl streaming. That's clickbait because it's not it's like it's awesome that it's surpassed that number, but
yeah,
people can tune in and tune out of a stream. And in the Super Bowl, the people who are watching the Super Bowl are generally there for the entire thing.
totally. Because it's a huge social event.
Right. So like while it's awesome and impressive they do that, or Ninja gets this stuff, it's like I personally care more about when a random person from a different industry that doesn't know anything about gaming comes up to me, they don't do something that Joe Rogan and Jimmy Kimmel did, which is like ha ha, or I just want to be like, I don't even want anything special, just like, oh, you do this, you're on broadcast of poker, or you were StarCraft world champion. That's cool. That's it. I don't really care for anything as long as it's not negative. So to me, Ninjas obviously and other gamers are helping with that, but as long as it goes into that direction, I don't. Me personally, I don't really care about the celebrity aspect, like that kind of echelon.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, you can make comments about the sort of dubious advantages and qualities of celebrity in general. You know, we live in a culture that reveres very unjustly reveres celebrities and gives them all of this deference and respect that, for the most part, is unearned. I think so. I think that celebrity is something that there's very little purpose in actually aspiring to that in general, because I
People,
think that most people who are celebrities, I think most of them will sort of tell you like this experience
is
is
not
mostly
good.
negative. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
not good at all. You get recognized, sure, and that's fun, I'm sure, for a week, and then you have the rest of your life where everybody views you a specific way, everybody treats you differently. You can never even really be sure if people's engagement with you is sincere or not,
right.
because really they just want a selfie and they want to brag to their friends on Instagram who they met at a restaurant, right? They have no respect. They don't know anything about you. They certainly don't respect you for that. It's
Sure.
just entirely about promoting themselves in social media.
And they want your professional respect versus to earning it themselves. Like like whatever you are in Magic the Gathering, I'm sure you're known for other things too, but that's what I was introduced to you, or it was introduced to me and then I meet you in person, and then the interaction with you in person plus the mentoring process, and that to me was like the cool aspect of knowing you. And then, like, of course, we didn't finish this, but going, us qualifying for Pro Tour, and then now having this podcast, it's like a continuation of something that happened in our youth. That to me, that's the cool aspect, I guess.
Have you ever told anybody your story about the cube? Have you ever shared that
Uh,
on
I
podcast at
did.
all?
I told Tom Martell, but the thing is, I didn't know. Like, I obviously would be flattered if I was credited with it. And I remember holding these like three big boxes around in the World Series. I'm like, let's draft, and like David Williams was there, Casey McCarroll was there, blah blah. Blah. But like, I don't know. I'd be very glad and grateful to be credited with,
I mean,
pioneering the jig.
whenever I've told the story of the cube, because it's part of the Magic lexicon at this point. Magic Online has a series of cubes that they roll out at any given time. There's always a cube that's one of the primary chief draft formats. And it's so funny because, like, the origin story of the deck, I think almost nobody even knows why it's called the cube at all. The story that I've told people is that the initial box that you guys had the
Three.
cards for your initial draft set in, it was three.
Yeah.
It wasn't always three, though. I imagine.
Okay, yeah. It started as one, and then two, and then it got to the point where there are just too many individual cards.
Yeah.
So I can tell the story from my point of view. So when I was at UC,
obviously, you do it far more justice than I would, and it's important for me to hear it too because I will continue to relay it.
oh yeah, I mean, I'm glad that you're relaying, and I would be glad to get credit for this. In UCSD, and I told this to John Sasso too, a supersize. Like, I'm gonna make a draft set with one of every individual card, and I brought it to, I started doing it. Of course, I'm missing a lot of the expensive cards, but when people play it, they're like, oh my God, this is so fun because you already know there's no duplicates. And then there's so many tough decisions, like bombs in certain sets in certain eras. Like, how do they compare? Like,
right, totally.
For example, Curse Scroll. Curse Scroll is not very good in Cube.
That's a great example. I think that's literally the best example of this idea that you're talking about. But go on.
So, like in Tempest, if you open Curse Scroll, boom, you don't even look at the rest of the pack.
Definitely not. And then you
look at the rest of the pack just to know what's out there. Yeah.
Yes.
But but then in Cube, you have stuff like Curse Scroll, Land Tax. Like, I'm trying to think of some like Morphling.
Yeah.
Or an X spell. Yeah, or an X spell. And X spells are
Fireball, yeah.
What's amazing about the X spells, at least in the version that I have, is that they are very good, but they aren't necessarily first picks. There's a lot of bombs that are just like straight up better.
Totally.
Something like the blue-black Dimir Guildmage, is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Dimir Guildmage. That guy is nuts.
Yeah,
like he's like not necessarily a bomb, but if there's no like super bomb, he's like one of the top guys for sure.
Totally. Absolutely. It's just a card that can completely snowball into a win all by itself. It's a 2-drop. It's a 2/2 for 2. So it's just solid in that regard.
And he's a tribute to the deck, James Day Tillman Disrupting Scepter in one card.
James Day Tillman Scepter in one card. Yeah. Both source.
Yeah, I made the cube, and it was like one, and that's why it's called the cube, because it's in those big ass boxes. And then I had in San Diego.
Was it technically in a rectangular box though?
Yeah,
like
rectangular box, but
important part of the story because it's not literally a cube. I've always said like you actually happen to just have this box that was a literal cube, and so all the cards fit nicely in there. And
oh no, it was those big ass.
My own imagination.
I'm glad to whatever. It's like I thought it was so awesome because as you know I have the most fun drafting. My performance shows that I'm better in constructed, but just drafting so has a feel that is just like unmatched in constructed. So we have this cube, or I created this cube. I have one, and then in UC San Diego, I have a buddy, Chris Chiang, who's a PhD student, and then David Fisher and like Andy Wang. So we would draft this like throughout the night, and it was like, I remember back when we were at match play, we would draft, and then at some point you're the responsible one. You're like, I got to go home, but that would last until like 2-3 a.m.
Not very responsible, I assure you. Yeah, normally we would leave that place and then go to Denny's and then play.
So
Denny's is 24 hours seek.
Yeah, and lions. But
Yeah, lions. That's right. The
with
low rent.
the cube, we were so degen, and I haven't played like 24 hours slash more than 24 hours in a game for like a really long time. But then when we had that, we actually did for like we actually drafted over 24 hours.
Wow.
So then one World Series of Poker came, and everybody was in the degen poker mode, and I just wanted to cube draft. So I brought that thing over, and in the one house, Euban, David Williams, Casey McCarroll, and a couple other Magic players. And we drafted it, and they were like, "Oh my god, this is awesome!" But money beats Magic at that mid-20s age. So
Yeah, of
even though
course.
they were really excited about it, that they went off. But I just kept building and building it until it was 3 boxes, and then I have real life responsibilities, so I ended up just like not continuing. So I don't know what happened, but at some point, it actually became a thing.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of when it actually started to propagate virally, beyond just hearing about it as something that you did. Because you would write to me periodically. I don't remember what avenue you were communicating with me in. I remember having conversations with you when I was living in Santa Barbara, and I lived in Santa Barbara between 2003 and 2007. So I remember you writing to me and asking me questions, like, for example, just asking me which card do you think is the best card, period, in the cube, based
Mm,
on the card set. What card's going to be most consistently insane? And I think that our agreement was, it might have, well, I mean, obviously outside, you had power in it though. You had ancestral recall and stuff, right?
I did, but it got to a point where they come up so infrequently
Yeah,
that
once you dilute it so much, it becomes less of a factor. But I remember mana draining during the conversation, apropos what we
yeah,
were talking about before, and the card treachery, for example, being another just absolutely top five windmill slam it 100% of the time. Like you'd take treachery over Black Lotus a lot of the time. And and actually, what's interesting is that I have my own cube that I've been working on and developing for more than a decade. Actually, it's gone through a million iterations and probably has no more than 20% of the cards in there were cards that it had when I first built it. Um, but seeing this sort of steady evolution and coming to understand, I've kind of touched on so many things in the creation of this cube. The big defining thing though that separates the cube that you guys played from the cube that most people who have heard of the term in modern day is that when you guys drafted your cube, you would always be dealing with you'd be drafting a very small subset of a larger card pool every time. Like
yes,
you do a draft with 4 people, your card pool is 1,200 cards. 4 people is only, what is that? It's only 12 packs, right? So 12 packs times 15, you're dealing with whatever, like 160 cards. It's a tiny cross section of a much bigger chunk of stuff.
yeah,
As a result of that, it's much harder to go after particular archetypes because in that
absolutely,
small subsection of the cube, an entire archetype might not be even supported. So, like for example, you open a pack and you go, "Damn, I really love mono red. I want to draft Jackal Pup." So you draft Jackal Pup first, but then just by pure coincidence, all the other good aggro creatures are in the other parts of the cube, and you wind up with a mono red deck where you have 1/1 drop, and then all your other things are threes because there were
yep,
just no drops, right? You could not draft mono red, and you got screwed because you picked mono red to go with. Your first you took Jackal Pup, then you took a Lightning Bolt, and you're like, okay, well, I'll just take this 3 mana thing, and I guess I'll take this 4 mana thing, and shit, there's no good red cards. I'll take a green card, and you're stuck in red. Before you know it, you have the worst deck in the world. And so
yep,
this is something that I kind of recognized in my own cube because the cubes that you and I were drafting, unlike the cubes that are drafted on Magic Online, and Magic Online, every card in the cube is in the pool every time you draft, 100% of the time. I believe that that's correct. I'm not 100% sure, but if you look at the list, because they publish the contents of every cube, if you look at the list, the list is 8 players, so it's 24 packs times 15, and that is the cube. That's the same. You're dealing with the same set of cards every single time, which obviously rewards foresight and preparation. But more importantly, if you draft a specific archetype, you always know that the archetype is going to be in
exists,
play.
yeah,
There's always going to be a storm deck. There's always going to be a splinter twin Kiki Jiki deck. There's always going to be a mono red deck. All the pieces are there every single time. So you can draft knowing that with that foresight and count on being able to get that deck consistently, provided that you're able to pick up the key pieces for it. You can look for it. You always know that there's going to be one of every dual land. And so you can play around that. So if you draft a fetch land, like if you prioritize drafting a fetch land, you know that there's going to be multiple
Awesome.
dual lands that intersect with that fetch land in the pool at that moment, and it's guaranteed. And that's so huge in terms of how you can go about constructing your cube, because you can actually put real archetypes into it. So I would say that for people out there listening to this podcast who want to build their own cubes, and you should give Wayne full credit for the concept. You need to decide if you're going to have always be drafting your cube with 8 players or 4 players or whatever, and you need to make your card. You need to adjust your card pool accordingly, because what will actually happen is if you make a broader subset of cards, like let's say in my case, I think my cube is around 600 cards usually, so it's enough to make around 36 to 38 packs total, and we're only drafting a small subset of that. What actually happens over time is that you'll see time and time and time again that savvy players will ignore all the fast stuff. They ignore all the beatdown creatures. They'll go like 14th and 15th pick, because beatdown is not a consistent strategy. It's one of those cards that, one of those deck archetypes that requires a critical mass of mana development, right? You need a mana curve. You need to make a real proper aggressive deck, you need like 4 or 5 1-drops. And then you need 7 or 8 2-drops. And then a few 3s, maybe a couple of 4s, and then some removal and land, and that's your deck. You're never ever going to consistently get that when you're dealing with 1,200 cards and you're only looking at a small subsection of that. It just won't work. So what happens is that reinforces the behavior where people will go and they'll draft and they'll just ignore the Savannah lands. They'll just never take Savannah lands because they know that it's a trap. And gradually over time, what happens is, since I'm constantly editing the deck based on the data, what cards are going 14th and 15th pick consistently? Well, I'm like, well, shit, nobody's drafted Jackal-Pup the last 9 drafts. It's gone 15th pick. And they pull it out. Or I'm sorry, so I pull the card out of the pool. And then I do that for lots of the other 1-drops, basically the aggro creature 1-drops. And before you know it, steadily evolving over time, the entire cube just shifts into this sort of weird mid-range, late-game bomby strategy. And there's no opportunity to play beatdown at all because all the beatdown creatures have been taken out. So you have to be very careful when you're constructing it. What really fundamentally matters as far as how you go about constructing your cube is how many people do you intend to be drafting this with in any given thing. And if like half or more of the cards are in play in every draft that you do and that's guaranteed, then you can actually put archetypes in. Otherwise, don't even bother. Just put in lots of good stuff and just accept the fact that it's going to be mid-range.
I enjoyed the fact that there were no archetypes because even in that, like you said, there's less beatdown. So when you do go beatdown, like you start picking up stupid things, like even 2/2s for 3, like morph creatures increase in value, like hill giants are, like, and those end up being fast enough in those environments to it's a beatdown, especially if everyone's curve is going higher up. But
That's super
it, it,
high.
it it's a different era, so like I'm just glad it caught on because I thought it was so fun just comparing uh bombs with bombs and just like how certain bombs in certain formats, when you completely blast out the environment, how they just like completely devalue.
Yeah, I mean, think of cards like original bombs like Shivan and Sarah Angel, completely overshadowed by modern design.
Oh
And that's
yeah.
obviously that's that's a quality of Magic power creep in general. I mean, Magic power creep has gotten, particularly with regards to Planeswalkers. I think Planeswalkers as a class of cards have just completely shifted everything about the game so fundamentally. And not only are Planeswalkers insanely powerful, but they've been really, really pushing Planeswalkers as a thing too, because Planeswalkers are sexy and they sell sets, they sell packs. There's an insane Planeswalker at 3 mana. People will buy packs to get that Planeswalker because it's super exciting to have it. The problem is that that causes long-term damage to the game, and a bunch of the 3 mana Planeswalkers that they made recently are extremely problematic. In fact,
I
I'm not sure how familiar you are with some of the more recent Planeswalkers, but they printed 2 Planeswalkers within the last, I think, year or so that have had to be banned in multiple formats because they're
I
just,
heard about them. I just like, I read the Twitter feed, so I see what's going on, but I don't experience it.
yeah, Oko, Thief
Oh
of
no. Yeah.
Crowns. Yeah,
Okay.
Oko is the real offender. I mean, Oko is the most powerful Planeswalker made by far, and it's so innocuous too. It's just an example of a very poor design, and that apparently there's one aspect of the card that was never tested properly. They made a modification to the card post development that elevated it from being a very solid card to being astronomically powerful. Are you familiar with what Oko does?
I only remember like 0/1 and gain life. Please just tell me the whole.
So the card has 4 loyalty at 3 mana. So it's already beefy from Planeswalker perspective. 4 loyalty at 3 is really nuts anyway, because it's very, very hard to interact with a 4 loyalty Planeswalker that early in the game, particularly if it comes down on turn 2, and it's quite easy. Its casting cost is 1 UG, so 1 blue, 1 green, 1 generic.
Yeah.
4 loyalty. It's 3 abilities. It's +2 ability, +2 loyalty, so it goes up to 6, is put a food token into play. And foods are something that was one of the primary mechanical innovations in the set that it came out in. A food token is just a generic artifact. It's just an artifact. But it's you can pay 2 mana and sacrifice a food token to gain 3 life. So that doesn't seem all that splashy. It's not really that exciting. But when you look at the second ability on Oko, and this is its primary problematic feature, it has a second ability which is +1 loyalty. It's not minus. It's not 0. It's +1. And it's turn any creature or artifact in play into a 3/3 elk with no abilities. So that could be the food that you made the first turn you played Oko. You play Oko turn 2, you make a food. Your opponent makes his turn 2 play. And on your turn, you transform your food into a 3. So you have a free hill giant. Oh, and Oko also has 7 loyalty on it, and it costs 3. How is your opponent killing a 7 loyalty Planeswalker, right? And it can continuously gain 2 every turn, or it can gain 1 loyalty a turn while simultaneously effectively destroying the best creature your opponent controls or their best artifact. And in formats, the more broad and crazy the format gets, the more insane that ability becomes. Imagine the card in Vintage, where you can play it on turn 1. And now you've got this impossibly gigantic loyalty Planeswalker in play that can turn their Moxes into garbage, irrelevant 3/3s. They get destroyed by mass removal or die to the abyss, or just don't matter at all because you're playing like a combo deck. And you can turn, like with Oko in play, they play their super bomby things like Trinisphere and Thorn of Amethyst, the things that are meant to bog down the game, and you're just turning them into shitty 3/3s that don't do anything. And meanwhile, the Planeswalker's just building up crazy amounts of loyalty as well. It's so insane. And if you haven't played it in your cube, I don't know how often you play cube, but Oko's so good. You know who LSV is, obviously. Luis Scott Vargas.
Yes. Yeah.
Of course. I mean, he's another player from our era. I met him.
Was he?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, maybe a little bit. He's a few years younger. I met LSV actually when he was going to UC Davis when I moved there in 1999.
Oh, okay. I thought
he was just like an 18-year-old kid who played at the local game store, who I was obviously very impressed by his abilities. At the time, I was a very serious competitive player, so I kind of approached him as the way that I did everybody else, as sort of a combination competitor/mentor role. But I mean, obviously, he's a genius, and he doesn't need any mentoring. He's figured out far more than I ever have about the game.
Yeah.
But LSV he's under the employ of Channel Fireball, actually.
Yeah.
That's his company, and he's one of their spokespeople. And incidentally, actually, he also worked with Matt Place on that game in Colorado, the Riot Project.
Wow.
Which actually eventually released. They completely rebranded and changed all of the art and the entire IP and re-released it, or eventually officially released it. The game is called Eternal. And you can download it and play it for free on iOS and other platforms. And it's actually quite fun. It's a very interesting hybrid of Magic and Hearthstone, although I'd say it's closer to Magic than it is to Hearthstone. They try to preserve a lot of what makes Magic fun and unique, including the randomness of mana, for example, is also in Eternal. The game's definitely worth taking a look at. But anyway, LSV I don't think he's affiliated with the game anymore. He used to be a spokesperson for it when he was working on it. But anyway, his most popular videos, I think, on YouTube to this day are Vintage Cube. And if you've never watched an LSV Vintage Cube video, you're doing yourself a grand disservice. If you haven't watched them, you should definitely do it.
I'll take a look.
Yeah, he just posted, because the Vintage Cube sort of it cycles on and off being available. I think about every 3 months they have it available again for a couple of weeks. And when it's available, LSV plays it compulsively. He plays, I think, more than 10 times, like 10 full, 3-round drafts in Vintage Cube with commentary, and he does it in real time. And it's quite amazing to watch because, obviously he's an incredibly skilled player. He's a Hall of Famer. And just watching his drafting and thought process, particularly with regards to the archetypes that I was talking about, it's really fascinating because most of the time when I watch people draft, I can kind of figure out what they're going to take. And with him, it's very hard to discern exactly what he's going to
really
take.
Wow.
But his results, are excellent. I mean, he seems to do extremely well. And he's told me several times that Vintage Cube is by far his favorite form of Magic, period, outside of any format at all. He loves it the most. Like, he waits for it patiently for months, and he's just chomping at the bit, waiting for the next opportunity to play Vintage Cube.
I
So
mean,
you've inspired someone as great and famous as LSV in terms of his Magic passions.
well, I mean, you started me, so I'd poke my head in, like, oftentimes in PTQs, like, I didn't even know I'd play him till that morning of. I literally just like wake up and I'm like, oh, I got some rebels for some draft, and just like throw them together and just like, play.
Oh, and just throw him in there?
For one of the PTQs, rebels block, I literally woke up at 8 a.m. I wasn't planning to play at all. I woke up at 8 a.m. like, oh, there's a PTQ this day, and obviously I drafted, so I threw together a ton, but I was missing Voice of Truth. I think the pro white 2/2 flyer,
Yeah,
and that.
Voice of Truth, I think. Yeah, yeah. There's eventually they made Voice of All, the one that you could just pick a color. But yeah, Voice of Truth is pro white, I think.
So this is the savage thing I did. I think I just googled what the hot decks were, and I saw rebels, and I looked at the deck list, and Massacre was in the format, so I did uh, an alternate version of Rebels in which I had Diving Griffins plus Ramosian Rally. If you tap a creature, it gets a +1/+1.
Oh, and Massacre.
Yeah, no, like to counter Massacre, but
Oh, to
also
counter Massacre. I was going to say you were going to play with Massacre as well,
no,
but I
no,
guess
no.
yeah, it's hard to run
Yeah,
swamps.
to counter Massacre plus Rebels were in the fields, so Ramosian Rally like just like boom, and then just like do that and just like
Yeah,
win the entire battle.
Diving Griffin had Vigilance, right? So you could
Yes,
attack with it and then use it to cast the +1/+1
yes,
for free. Very clever.
and then hey,
Lynn Civi doesn't die to Massacre though, so she just gets more stuff.
I think Lynn Civi was banned, but Ramosian Sargent wasn't.
Oh, okay, yeah, Lynn Civi. That's like, incidentally, that was the only pro tour I ever was qualified for that I didn't attend. Was the one, the Mercadian Masks Pro Tour, and I think it was in New York City. But yeah, I won the qualifier and then didn't go because I was said, you know what, I have no interest in playing this dumb format where like you play your Lynn Civi and then they can't cast theirs because of the legendary rule.
Oh, I don't remember at the time,
Remember
but
that?
I remember that rule, but they keep changing that rule, right?
They
Or
changed it in. I found out recently actually. They changed it in late 1999. They made it so that you could actually, or maybe they didn't actually. No, no, I think they didn't. The rule was is that basically if you had a legend in play and they played another one, it annihilated it instantly. So the
yeah,
new one coming into play was you could play it, but it was it died instantly. However, because of the mana source rule at the time, you could do something like if I had a Tolarian Academy in play, you could play your own Tolarian Academy, and before it died, you could tap it for mana, get mana out of it like a giant blue ritual. You can't do that anymore, actually. Although, well, you couldn't do it for a while. Now you can because the legend rule has been almost completely done away with. In fact, you and I can both have an Oko Thief of Crowns in play at the same time with no conflict. And if they were to make another Oko, like Oko Thief of Dreams or something, another version of it, I could play that alongside Oko Thief of Crowns on the same side of the battlefield and it wouldn't cause any conflict. So they've loosened it up a ton. But the reason why I mentioned Oko and LSV, though, is because I saw a recent draft where he went out of his way and included a third color or an extra color just in order to play Oko, because that's how insane it was. And this is in a format that has Black Lotus, Ancestor Recall, the Moxes, Time Walk, Time Twister, Mind Twist, Armageddon, everything. And he's splashing Oko because it's that insane. Yeah, it is really, really ridiculous.
So to cap off the rebel block, the Voice of Truth, the 2/2 pro white creature, that was integral in the sideboard matches.
Yeah, to beat Rebels, right? What do they do
Yeah.
against it, right? They can't remove it. It blocks everything.
So actually, I bought him from Chris Cade that morning.
Really?
I didn't have him in the sideboard because who the hell has those cards?
Yeah, why did he have Voice of Truth? I guess maybe he figured out that they were good in Rebels.
Oh no, he knew. He had his binder was full of them.
Oh, I see.
But those were the key cards. That was the only card I had that I didn't have. So I bought like 4 of them for literally sideboard only, and I just like top 8'd, and like everyone when they saw the Diving Griffin, they're like, "What the hell what are you doing with this?" And then
yeah, what is this thing? It's not a Rebel.
And then when they saw the
Ramosian Rally getting blown up by it, yeah.
I did that like because what people were doing, they were playing Parallax Wave to like stall, and I think I had 2 I only played 2 because I was like it's diminishing returns, parallax wave.
Yeah.
So, and of course, if you blow the other time and kill them, it's fine. But I would just get into combat and just wipe their board with Ramosian Rally. Like, why not just like
Yeah,
kill
you
his
don't even
board?
need the parallax wave. I think the other reason why parallax wave was important is because it did give you a way to deal with their Linsivvy. If they got Linsivvy in play, you could play parallax wave, wave their Linsivvy
Oh, there
out,
was
play
no
their.
Lin Civi. It was banned
Oh, it
in
was
the
banned
block
by then.
format. Yeah,
Okay, maybe.
yeah.
I'm not.
Whatever.
Yeah,
It was just
unbanned
like
for a while.
I just Googled it that morning and just like whatever. It was just a trivia thing to call back to Chris K. That's pretty funny. Um, yeah. So then Magic, I guess. After Magic, you did the Diablo 2 stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's Diablo sort of arrived during this segue period where I'd been playing Magic professionally really since mid 1994 up through. I mean, I was playing it professionally before there was an actual pro tour because it was when I say professional, right? When you do something as a lifestyle choice and your livelihood kind of depends on how well you do at it, then you're a de facto professional, even if you're not.
Professional Gamer Podcast. There's the icon. So
Yeah, yes, exactly. So I was definitely a professional Magic player before the Pro Tour began. And then I did the Pro Tour thing for 4 years. And as you know from your own experience, pretty much from esports, it becomes increasingly hard to justify the amount of time you're investing in this, essentially in a hobby, for a very, very inconsistent financial return.
yeah.
I'm sure many people who are poker players have had to do this sort of self-reflection and self-examination too. This idea of like, am I really good enough to continue to do this? Because my results are not aligning with, I win occasionally, but my results are not aligning with my expectation. And I'm sinking inordinate amounts of time into this activity at the expense of other things I could be doing in my life, because that's something you always have to factor in. It's not just that you're not winning money doing the thing that you're passionate about, but you're also not advancing another career that might actually lead somewhere too. And I was increasingly really starting to feel that around 1999, 2000, with regards to Magic. It was extremely hard to justify the amount of time that was necessary to really stay at the very top of the game to be competitive as a pro. Because there were people at that point, I guess I was 25 or
Finkel,
26.
Finkel and Kai Boudet were names, I think.
Yeah, that was certainly the period when they had become very dominant. Finkel, I think he's 4 years younger than me, 3 or 4 years younger. But yeah, I mean, obviously he was a household name and he had enjoyed a level of financial success at the game that was really unprecedented at that point. Even the best players, nobody had done more than like win one pro tour and make top 8 a couple of times. But unless you won, even if you got second, and certainly if you got top 4, the amount of money that you got relative to maintaining the lifestyle was just not enough at all.
Right.
I mean, I lived basically as a bare bones subsistence starvation Magic player, this itinerant Magic player during that entire period from really 1995 when I started really when I dropped out or took a leave of absence from Santa Cruz up until 2000 ish. I had no money. I was absolutely destitute. When I was a pro player, I remember going to Pro Tour Mainz in Germany. It's beautiful, ancient city, former East Germany, I think. And I was so poor. I was flown out there. I had a sponsor who paid for my hotel and my plane flight to wear their shirt. I don't even remember what it was for. It was something that Mark Justice brokered. I was so poor that the only food I ate on this whole trip was the continental breakfast at the hotel in the morning. I couldn't even afford food at the venue or anything. So I'd go eat the breakfast. I couldn't afford transportation. So I walked from the hotel 2 miles or whatever, the tournament center in the morning at like 6:30 in the morning through downtown Mainz, played in the event the whole day, and then walked home or walked back to the hotel and just went to bed. There was nothing else for me to do. Like that was really my life for years. And I had the stamina and the passion to do it in my early 20s.
Oh yeah.
But by the time that, like 2000 had rolled around, it was just getting increasingly hard to justify the time. And my grandfather in particular would call me up all the time and say, what are you doing with your life? You have a lot of potential. You could do really well at a lot of things if you really apply yourself. Why are you wasting your time with this stupid game still?
And he was right.
The truth is, though, is that honestly, the years that I invested in Magic, and not only what that taught me in terms of really, really devoting myself, because that was the first opportunity I had to really devote myself to something to a mastery level. up to that point, I played Street Fighter, but it was always in parallel with all these other things, doing high school and so on, and then college. I'd never really invested the time to really truly be great at Street Fighter because I just couldn't, even if I'd wanted to. I ran and wrestled competitively in high school, but I never was able to devote the time to become particularly great at those things either. But Magic was the first time that I was able to put 10,000 plus hours into something and became truly great at it. So it was very hard for me to walk away from that, to sort of turn my back on all that investment, particularly because I felt like it had never been something that had really risen to its full potential.
Yeah.
That it was too early, but it became too hard to justify the time and emotional investment. It was so frustrating to play in those events. I would practice for months, and as just the short-term RNG that's endemic to Magic is so high that you could just scrub out in tournament after tournament after tournament, no matter how much preparation you had. It's just like poker in that way.
Yeah.
You can be the best poker player at your entire casino for a month and do nothing but lose.
Yep.
And you have to, not only do you have to have the emotional resiliency to go through that and endurance, but you need to have the bankroll too, right? The bankroll management is the fundamental key to surviving a period like that. And many people go broke and can never come back. And in Magic, you never even have the potential upside that poker can afford you, where you can go on a hot streak and you can win $200,000 and then live off that for a couple of years. Like that doesn't exist in Magic at all. You might do well. And when I did well, I made top 8 twice in relatively a short span of time on the Pro Tour, season 1 and season 2. My net win from that was $8,400. $8,400 spread out across 2 years. And that's 2 top 8s. That's doing really, really well. And I had a top 16 as well in there too, which won me like 3,200 or something. But I mean, it's way below a slave wage. It's nothing, right?
Yeah.
It's totally unsustainable. So by 2000, I was sort of just looking around going, I love this. I love the game, but this is not going anywhere. And I need to get more serious about my life. So I went back to finally get my bachelor's degree at UC Davis.
I remember.
Right around that time. Yeah, because remember, I was still commuting down to the Bay Area. You were still seeing me. I mean, obviously, we qualified for the Pro Tour and we played in other events and stuff during that span when I was commuting from Davis to the Bay Area to play in Magic events and stuff.
Give me 1 sec.